The rope burns on her wrists told a story no decent man should witness. In a Texas town square, 19-year-old Lila Gray stood barefoot on an auction block, not as a bride, not as help, but as property, sold by the father who should have protected her. The drunk bastard called her deaf and dumb, but she works good enough. When her eyes met those of Jonah Reddick, a scarred rancher who'd come only to buy a horse, something passed between them that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with recognition. Two damaged souls seeing each other clearly for the first time. He bought her for the price of good livestock, rode away with a girl who couldn't speak and a half-dead mare, and discovered that silence can hear more than any scream ever could. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Lila and Jonah's story travels. Stay until the end, because what happens between them will change everything you think you know about listening, loving, and being truly heard. The sun had no mercy that August morning, beating down on the town of Bitter Creek like a smithy's hammer on an anvil. Jonah Reddick had ridden in before dawn, leading his bay gelding through streets still empty except for dogs and the occasional drunk sleeping off last night's whiskey. He'd made the 2-day journey for one reason only. Samuel Yates had a mare for sale, a good bloodline despite hard times, and Jonah needed new stock if his ranch was going to survive another winter. He was a man of 34 who looked older. A thick scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, a souvenir from a war he tried not to remember and a father he'd buried with his own hands. His dark hair hung past his collar, unwashed, and his clothes carried the dust of miles. People in Bitter Creek knew him by reputation. Reddick, the hermit rancher who came to town twice a year, bought what he needed and left before sundown. They said he'd killed men during the war, that his land was cursed, that his father had died mad and violent. Jonah never corrected them. The truth was worse than their gossip, and silence cost him nothing. He tied his horse outside Yates's livery and found the man already awake, chewing tobacco and spitting into the dirt. "Reddick," Yates said, not offering his hand. "Figured you'd show. Mare's out back. She's thin, but sound. $100. Let me see her first." The mare was a sorrel with a white blaze, ribs showing through her coat, but her eyes were bright and her legs clean. Jonah ran his hands over her flanks, checked her teeth, watched her move. She was undernourished but not broken. He could work with that. 75, Jonah said. 90, and that's robbery. 80, final offer. Yates spat again, nodded. Cash. Jonah pulled the bills from his vest pocket, counted them out slowly. Yates took the money without a word, already turning away. Take her now. I got business in town. What business? Auction, Yates said, grinning with brown teeth. Harry Gray's selling off everything he owns. Drunk bastard lost his farm, his wife, and now he's selling the girl. Ought to be a spectacle. Something cold moved through Jonah's chest. The girl? His daughter, deaf and dumb, from what I hear. Can't talk, can't hear, but she's young enough and works hard. Some rancher will buy her for cheap labor. Or, Yates shrugged, the implication ugly and clear. Jonah's jaw tightened. Where? Town Square. Noon. You planning to bid? Yates laughed like he'd told a joke. Didn't figure you for the type. Jonah didn't answer. He took the mare's lead rope, walked her to the water trough, let her drink. His hands were steady, but something inside him had shifted, like a stone dislodged in a river. He told himself it was none of his business. He'd come for a horse, not to witness whatever fresh hell Bitter Creek thought passed for civilization. He should load his supplies, mount up, and ride back to his ranch before the sun got too high. But he didn't. At 11:30, Jonah found himself walking toward the town square, the mare trailing behind him. A crowd had gathered, maybe 40 people, farmers and merchants and ranch hands looking for entertainment on a slow Saturday. A makeshift platform had been built from old crates and planks, and standing on it was a man Jonah recognized from years ago. Harry Gray, older now, bloated with drink and failure, swaying slightly as he shouted to the crowd. Folks, I got tools, I got furniture, I got a good plow that'll last another 10 years. Everything must go, and I mean everything. Gray's voice was hoarse, desperate. But first, I got something special. Something you won't see at no regular auction. He gestured behind him, and a girl stepped forward. Jonah's breath caught. She was small, maybe 19, with dark hair that hung in tangles past her shoulders. She wore a dress that had once been blue, but was now faded to gray, torn at the hem, too large for her thin frame. Her feet were bare, dusty, the nails cracked. But it was her face that stopped him, pale, angular, with dark eyes that held no tears, no fear, just a kind of vast, ancient weariness that made Jonah think of winter fields and empty rooms. Around her wrists were ropes, tied tight enough to leave marks. Gray held the other end like a leash. "This here's my daughter, Lila," Gray announced, his voice taking on a showman's cadence. "Now, I ain't gonna lie to you. Girl's got her limitations. She's deaf, can't hear a word you say. Don't talk neither, not a sound since she was 5 years old. But she's strong, she works hard, and she don't complain about nothing because she can't." He yanked the rope, pulling her forward, and Lila stumbled but caught herself, her expression never changing. "She can cook, clean, mend, tend animals. She's young enough to bear children if that's what you're after, and she won't talk back because she can't. I'm starting the bidding at $50. The crowd murmured. Some laughed. A few looked uncomfortable, but no one left. Jonah felt something dark and hot rising in his throat. He'd seen terrible things during the war, had done terrible things himself, but this, a father selling his own daughter like livestock, was a different kind of evil. It was calculated, sober cruelty dressed up as necessity. $50, Gray shouted again. "Come on, boys, that's cheaper than a good horse, and she'll last longer." A man near the front called out, "She's simple in the head, Harry?" "Nah, she's smart enough, just can't hear her talk. Makes her quiet, which is more than I can say for most women." More laughter from the crowd, and Gray's grin widened. "She knows what work is, I'll tell you that. Raised her myself after her ma run off." $30, someone shouted. A rancher Jonah didn't know, older, with a gut that hung over his belt and eyes that lingered too long on Lila's thin form. 30. I got 30. Who'll give me 40? 35. A younger man this time, looking more curious than cruel. 40. The first rancher again, his voice aggressive now, competitive. Jonah watched Lila's face. She stood perfectly still, her bound hands in front of her, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the crowd. She didn't look at her father. She didn't look at the men bidding on her. She looked at nothing, and Jonah understood that look. It was the look of someone who had learned to survive by disappearing inside themselves, by making their spirit small enough that cruelty couldn't reach it. He'd worn that look himself once, in a field hospital after Shiloh, when the surgeon had taken a saw to the man in the cot next to him, and Jonah had closed his eyes and gone somewhere far away. 50, the older rancher called. $50, Harry, and I'll take her now. Gray's eyes lit up. 50. I got 50. Anyone willing to go higher? Silence. The older rancher was already stepping forward, pulling bills from his pocket, licking his lips. Jonah's voice cut across the square like a knife. 75. Every head turned. Gray squinted, trying to place him. The older rancher's face darkened. "Who the hell are you?" $75, Jonah repeated, stepping through the crowd. People moved aside, their expressions wary. He stopped at the edge of the platform, looking up at Gray. "Cash, right now." Gray's confusion shifted to calculation. "You're that rancher, ain't you? Reddick? The one with the place up in the hills?" 75, Jonah said again, ignoring the question. "Now, hold on," the older rancher sputtered. "I was here first. I bid 50, and I bid 75. You want to go higher?" The man's face reddened. He looked at Lila, then at Jonah, then at the crowd watching with hungry interest. 80, he said finally, his voice tight with anger. 100, Jonah said immediately. The square went quiet. $100 was a fortune, more than most men made in 6 months. Gray was staring at Jonah like he'd just offered to buy the sun. 100, Gray repeated slowly, as if testing the words. "Cash?" Jonah reached into his vest, pulled out the roll of bills he'd brought for supplies and winter provisions. He counted out $100, slow and deliberate, then held it up for everyone to see. "Cash. Take it or leave it." Gray nearly fell off the platform in his rush to grab the money. "Sold! Sold to Mr. Reddick!" He shoved the bills into his pocket, then tossed the end of the rope to Jonah like it was garbage. "She's all yours, friend. Good luck with her." Jonah caught the rope. He looked down at it, at the rough hemp that had worn raw marks into Lila's wrists, and felt something crack open inside his chest. Slowly, carefully, he pulled a knife from his belt and cut the rope, letting it fall to the ground. Lila's eyes moved then, finally, shifting from that faraway nothing to Jonah's face. She stared at him, her expression unreadable, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other while the crowd whispered and Gray counted his money and the sun beat down on them both like judgment. Jonah didn't know what to say. He didn't know if she could understand him even if he did speak. So he just nodded once, a small, awkward gesture, and then turned away, leading the mare toward his horse. Behind him, he heard footsteps. Light, barefoot, following. He didn't look back. He just kept walking, out of the square, away from the crowd, away from Harry Gray and his poison and his shame. When he reached his horse, he tied the mare's lead to his saddle, then mounted up. Only then did he turn to look at Lila. She stood a few feet away, her cut wrists held close to her chest, her dark eyes watching him with that same impossible calm. Waiting. "Can you ride?" Jonah asked, then immediately felt stupid. If she was deaf, she couldn't hear him. But Lila tilted her head slightly, considering, then shook it. "No." Jonah let out a breath. "All right then." He shifted in his saddle, held out his hand. "You'll ride with me." For a moment he thought she might refuse, might run, might do anything except what she did, which was step forward, take his hand, and let him pull her up behind him. She was lighter than he expected, all bones and hunger, and when she settled against his back, her arms coming around his waist to hold on, he felt the tremor in her hands, the first sign that she was anything other than stone. "We're going to my ranch," Jonah said, knowing she couldn't hear but needing to say it anyway. "It's 2 days' ride. I've got food, water, and a place for you to sleep. You don't have to be afraid." Lila didn't respond, of course, but her grip on his vest tightened slightly, just enough for him to feel it, and Jonah took that as answer enough. He turned his horse north, toward the hills, toward home, and rode out of Bitter Creek without looking back. The first day passed in silence. They rode through scrubland and rocky hills, following trails that only Jonah knew. The sun hammered them from above, and the mare plodded along behind, already looking stronger with water and a handful of oats. Jonah stopped twice to let the horses rest and to offer Lila the canteen. Each time she took it carefully, drank a little, and handed it back without meeting his eyes. He tried not to think about what he'd done. $100. That was his winter money, his emergency fund, the security that stood between him and starvation if the herd got sick or the crops failed. He just spent it on a girl he didn't know, couldn't communicate with, and had no idea what to do with. But every time doubt crept in, he remembered the rope around her wrists and the look in her eyes when she'd stood on that platform, and the doubt faded. He'd made the right choice. Maybe the only choice. As the sun began to set, Jonah found a sheltered spot beneath a rock overhang and made camp. He unsaddled the horses, started a small fire, and set about making a simple meal: hardtack, dried beef, and coffee. Lila sat a few feet away, her knees pulled to her chest, watching him work. He wanted to say something, wanted to reassure her somehow, but he didn't know how. Instead, he focused on the practical. He filled a bowl with food, handed it to her. She took it, nodded once, a gesture of thanks, and ate slowly, methodically, like someone who'd learned to make meals last. Jonah ate his own portion, then poured himself coffee. The firelight played across Lila's face, casting shadows that made her look even younger, more fragile. He found himself studying her, trying to understand. Her father had said she'd been deaf and mute since she was 5. What had happened? An illness? An accident? And why had her mother left? As if sensing his thoughts, Lila looked up, caught him watching. For a moment, he expected her to look away, to retreat back into that protective silence. But she didn't. Instead, she set down her bowl, reached into her dress pocket, and pulled out something small and white. Chalk. Jonah watched, fascinated, as she moved to a flat rock near the fire and began to write. Her letters were careful, practiced, formed with the precision of someone who'd spent years learning to communicate without sound. When she finished, she turned the rock toward him. "My name is Lila Gray. Thank you for buying me. I will work hard." The words hit Jonah harder than he expected. "You don't have to," he started, then stopped. She couldn't hear him. He was talking to air. Frustrated, he looked around, then grabbed a stick from the fire, blew out the ember, and used the charred end to write on the dirt near her rock. "You don't owe me work. I didn't buy you like property." Lila read it, her brow furrowing. Then she wrote again. "Then why did you pay for me?" Jonah stared at the question. Why had he? He didn't have a good answer, at least not one he could explain in dirt and charcoal. He wrote, "Because what your father did was wrong." Lila read it, and something flickered across her face, surprise maybe, or disbelief. She wrote again, faster now. Everyone watched. No one else stopped him. "I know." "Why you?" Jonah hesitated. He could write something noble, something that would make him sound better than he was. But Lila's eyes were too direct, too knowing. She'd seen him in that square, had watched him step forward when no one else would, and she deserved honesty. He wrote, "Because I know what it feels like to be sold." Lila's eyes widened. She stared at the words, then at Jonah, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw emotion crack through that careful mask. Surprise, understanding, and something that might have been kinship. She wrote, "How?" Jonah looked at the question, at the fire, at the darkness pressing in beyond their small circle of light. He didn't want to answer. He'd spent years not answering, not talking, not letting anyone close enough to ask. But something about this girl, about the way she watched him with those ancient, weary eyes, made him want to try. He took the stick and wrote carefully, "My father sold me to the army when I was 15, said it was my duty. I fought for 4 years. When I came home, he was drunk and violent. I had to put him down like a sick dog. I have lived alone ever since." It was the most he'd told anyone in a decade. The words sat there in the dirt, raw and ugly and true. Lila read them twice, her expression shifting from curiosity to something deeper, recognition, empathy, grief. When she looked up at him again, her eyes were wet, the first tears he'd seen from her. She didn't write anything more. She just nodded, slow and solemn, and Jonah understood that she'd heard him. Not with her ears, but with something else. Something that went deeper than sound. They sat in silence after that, the fire burning low, the horses shifting quietly in the darkness. Eventually, Jonah spread out his bedroll and gestured for Lila to take it. She shook her head, but he insisted, pointing firmly at the blankets. She hesitated, then relented, curling up close to the fire with the kind of careful stillness that spoke of years spent making herself small. Jonah sat with his back against the rock, his rifle across his lap, watching the darkness. He didn't sleep much anyway. Hadn't in years. The nightmares always found him, dreams of cannon fire and screaming horses, and his father's face twisted with rage and madness. But tonight, with Lila sleeping a few feet away and the stars wheeling overhead, the darkness felt a little less heavy. Maybe, he thought, he'd done something right for once. They reached the ranch late the next afternoon. It wasn't much. A small cabin, a barn, a few corrals, all of it built by Jonah's hands over the past 6 years. The land around it rolled away in all directions, grassland broken by rocky outcroppings and the occasional stand of cottonwoods. A creek ran along the eastern edge, reliable even in drought, and the hills rose to the north, creating a natural barrier against the worst of the winter winds. Jonah had inherited the land from his father, though inherited wasn't quite the right word. He'd taken it, claimed it, buried his father on a hilltop under a cairn of stones, and decided that this place, cursed or not, would be his. He pulled his horse to a stop in front of the cabin and dismounted, then helped Lila down. She stood unsteadily for a moment, stiff from 2 days of riding, then looked around with careful, assessing eyes. Jonah watched her, trying to see the place through her perspective. The cabin was weathered but solid, with a stone chimney and real glass windows he'd bartered for in town. The barn was newer, built 3 years ago when he'd finally saved enough for decent lumber. The corrals held 4 horses and a dozen cattle, thin but healthy. It was a working ranch, modest and lonely, but it was clean, and it was his. Lila walked toward the cabin, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. She reached the door, hesitated, then looked back at Jonah, a question in her eyes. He gestured. "Go ahead." She opened the door and stepped inside. The cabin was a single large room with a loft above. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a table and 2 chairs sat near the window, and a narrow bed occupied the far corner. Everything was neat, almost obsessively so, the kind of order a man maintains when he lives alone and has nothing else to fill his time. The floor was swept, the dishes clean, the few books Jonah owned stacked carefully on a shelf. Lila moved through the space slowly, her fingers trailing over the table, the back of a chair, the edge of the fireplace mantel. Jonah stood in the doorway, suddenly self-conscious. What was she seeing? What was she thinking? She turned to face him, and on her face was an expression he hadn't expected. Relief. Pure, simple relief, like a person who'd been lost in a storm and finally found shelter. She wrote on a small piece of chalk slate she'd produced from her pocket. "It's clean, safe. Thank you." Jonah nodded, not trusting himself to respond. He stepped outside, busied himself with the horses, unsaddling them and turning them out to pasture. The mare followed the other horses eagerly, already fitting in. When he came back inside, Lila had found his broom and was sweeping the floor, even though it didn't need sweeping. He wanted to tell her to stop, that she didn't need to earn her keep, but he understood what she was doing. She was staking a claim, making herself useful, proving her value. He'd done the same thing when he'd first come back from the war, working himself to exhaustion every day because action was easier than thought. So he let her sweep. He let her find a rag and wipe down the table, let her organize his meager food supplies, let her claim a small corner of the cabin as her own. And when she finally stopped, when she turned to him with exhaustion written across her face, he pointed to his bed. She shook her head, pointed to the floor. He pointed to the bed more firmly. She wrote, "Where will you sleep?" He wrote back, "The loft." I was going to build another bed anyway. It was a lie. He had no plans to build another bed. But Lila looked at him like she knew it was a lie and was grateful for it anyway. She nodded, sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled. It was a small smile, tentative, barely there, but it transformed her face completely, made her look young and almost hopeful. Jonah felt something shift in his chest, something he'd thought long dead. He turned away quickly, busied himself with starting a fire, with putting on coffee, with anything that would keep him from looking at her and wondering what the hell he'd gotten himself into. The first week passed in a strange, gentle rhythm. Lila woke before dawn each morning, before even Jonah, and by the time he climbed down from the loft, she'd have the fire going, coffee made, and breakfast cooking. She moved through the cabin like a ghost, silent and efficient, anticipating needs before they arose. When Jonah went out to check the herd, she came with him, watching how he worked, learning. When he mended fence, she handed him tools before he asked. When he worked with the horses, she stood at the edge of the corral, perfectly still, and the animals, even the skittish ones, would drift toward her, calm and curious. It was unnerving at first. Jonah had lived alone for so long that having another presence in his space felt like an intrusion, even a welcome one. But Lila had a gift for making herself small, for being there without demanding anything, and slowly he began to relax. They communicated through writing, through gestures, through a developing language of looks and nods that surprised Jonah with its effectiveness. He learned that Lila had been taught to read and write by her mother before the woman had fled, that she'd kept up the practice in secret, hiding books and chalk from her father. He learned that she'd taken care of the farm animals, had a gift for knowing when they were sick or in pain, had kept the household running while her father drank himself into oblivion. And he learned that she was afraid of loud noises, not because she could hear them, but because she could feel them. Thunder made her flinch. The crack of breaking wood sent her into corners. Anything sudden, anything violent, turned her into stone. One afternoon, about 10 days after her arrival, Jonah was splitting wood near the cabin when he brought the axe down wrong. The log exploded, a large piece flying toward the cabin and crashing against the wall with a sharp bang. Lila, who'd been inside kneading bread, appeared in the doorway so fast Jonah nearly dropped the axe. Her face was white, her eyes huge, her whole body rigid with fear. "It's okay," Jonah said reflexively, then remembered. She couldn't hear him. He set down the axe carefully, held up his hands to show they were empty, tried to project calm through his body language. Slowly, Lila's breathing steadied. She looked at him, at the axe, at the broken wood, and understanding crossed her face. She came down the steps, walked to where he stood, and placed one hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. She held it there for a moment, feeling his heartbeat, steady and calm. Then she nodded and went back inside. Jonah stood frozen, the echo of her touch burning through his shirt. It had been so long since anyone had touched him with anything other than violence or necessity. The simple intimacy of it, the trust it required, shook something loose inside him. That night, when they sat by the fire after dinner, Lila wrote, "You are kind, but sad. Why?" Jonah stared at the words, at this girl who'd known him less than 2 weeks and who had somehow looked past his scars and his silence and seen straight to the broken thing at his core. He wrote, "Lost too much. Did things I cannot take back. In the war? Yes. And after." Lila studied him for a long moment, then wrote, "You carry it like weight. I see it. Your shoulders. Your eyes." Jonah had no answer for that. She was right. He did carry it, every day, every moment, the weight of his father's death, and the men he'd killed and the parts of himself he'd left on battlefields from Tennessee to Virginia. Lila wrote again, "I'm sorry." "For what?" "That you hurt. I wish I could help." Jonah looked at her, this small, silent girl who'd been sold like livestock, who'd survived God knew what kind of hell, and who was sitting in his cabin offering him comfort. Something inside him cracked a little wider. He wrote, "You do help. You being here helps." Lila read it, and her eyes went soft. She didn't write anything else. She just moved a little closer to the fire, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and they sat that way until the flames died down to embers and the night pressed close around them. 3 weeks in, the mare went into labor. Jonah woke in the dark to find Lila gone from the cabin. Panic shot through him, irrational, immediate, and he scrambled down from the loft, his heart pounding. The door stood open, cool night air flowing in, and he could see a light in the barn. He ran. Inside, he found Lila kneeling in the straw beside the mare, her hands gentle on the horse's swollen belly, her face calm and focused. The mare was breathing hard, her eyes rolling, but she wasn't panicking. Lila had somehow gotten her to lie down, had arranged fresh straw, had brought water and clean cloths. Jonah stopped in the doorway, breathing hard. "How did you know?" he asked, then cursed himself. She couldn't hear him. But Lila looked up, and there was something in her eyes, a knowing, an awareness that went beyond the physical. She placed one hand on the mare's side, then pointed to her own chest over her heart. She'd felt it. Somehow she'd felt the horse's distress, had known before any physical signs appeared. Jonah knelt beside her, and together they worked through the long hours of labor. The foal came just before dawn, slick and trembling, perfect. Lila helped clean it, guided it to its feet, watched with fierce protectiveness as it took its first wobbly steps toward its mother. When it was over, when the mare was nursing and the foal was steady, Lila turned to Jonah, and her face was radiant. She looked years younger, all the weariness burned away by the simple joy of new life. She wrote in chalk on the barn wall, "She knew I would help. Animals know. They feel me feeling them." Jonah stared at the words, trying to understand. "You can sense them? Their pain, their needs?" She couldn't hear the question, but she seemed to understand it anyway. She nodded, wrote more. "Always. Since I was small. Before I lost my hearing. Maybe that's why I lost it. Too much feeling, too loud inside my head." Jonah felt a chill run down his spine. He thought about the way the horses calmed around her, the way she knew when the cattle were sick, the way she'd found him in the barn that first night when she hadn't even known where the barn was. "You can feel people too?" Lila hesitated, then nodded. Wrote, "Sometimes. Strong feelings, pain, fear, sadness, like echoes, like thunder in my bones." "Is that why your father sold you?" Her face closed down, the light in her eyes guttering. She wrote 3 words. He was afraid. Jonah wanted to push, wanted to understand, but he could see the pain in every line of her body, so instead he just nodded, stood, and offered her his hand. She took it, let him pull her to her feet, and they walked back to the cabin together through the breaking dawn. But something had changed between them. Jonah had thought he understood what he'd taken on when he'd bought Lila from her father. He'd thought he was saving a deaf girl who needed help, giving her a home, doing the right thing. Now he understood that Lila was something else entirely. She wasn't broken or damaged or simple. She was a person with a gift so powerful and strange that it terrified people. A gift that let her hear the world in ways that had nothing to do with sound. And more than that, she'd been using that gift on him. She'd been feeling his sadness, his rage, his guilt, carrying it like a weight she hadn't asked for. That night, when they sat by the fire, Jonah wrote, "When you touch me, you feel what I feel, yes?" Lila read it, and for a moment he thought she might deny it. But she was too honest for that. She nodded. "Always?" She shook her head, wrote, "Only when I touch, or when feelings are very strong. Your pain is strong. Does it hurt you to feel it?" Lila considered, then wrote carefully, "No, it makes me understand. Everyone carries pain. Yours is not worse than mine, just different." Jonah stared at the words, at this girl who'd spent weeks living with him, absorbing his nightmares and his grief, and who called it understanding instead of burden. He wrote, "You should not have to carry my pain." Lila read it, and her eyes were fierce when she looked up at him. She wrote quickly, the chalk scratching loud in the quiet cabin. "I choose to. You carried me away from my father. You gave me home. This is how I give back, by seeing you, by knowing you, by not being afraid of what you carry." Jonah's throat tightened. He looked at this small, fierce girl, and he realized something that terrified him more than any battlefield, any nightmare, any ghost. He was starting to care about her. Not as a responsibility or an obligation, but as a person. As someone whose presence made his cabin feel less empty and his days feel less gray. As someone he might, if he wasn't careful, come to need. He didn't write anything else that night. He just nodded, once, and Lila seemed to understand. She curled up in her usual corner, wrapped in one of his old blankets, and fell asleep with her hand resting against the wall, as if even in sleep she needed to feel the world around her. Jonah sat by the fire long after she drifted off, watching the flames, thinking about gifts and curses and the strange ways that broken people sometimes found each other in the darkness. Outside, the new foal whickered softly, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled across the hills. Jonah felt it shake the cabin, felt it in his bones, and for the first time he understood a little of what Lila experienced every day, the world speaking in vibrations and pressure and the invisible language of feeling. He wondered what it would be like to live that way, to sense emotion like weather, to carry the pain of others like stones in your pockets. He wondered how she'd survived it for so long. And he wondered, with a fear that sat cold in his belly, what would happen if the town ever found out about her gift? Because gifts like Lila's had a way of making people afraid. And fear, Jonah knew from long experience, always turned to violence in the end. The fear Jonah carried proved prophetic exactly 6 weeks after Lila arrived. It started small, the way trouble always did in places like Bitter Creek. Martha Henley, the minister's wife, came out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning with a sick hen tucked under her arm and desperation written across her round face. She'd heard, she said, that the Reddick place had a girl who was good with animals, and her prize layers were dying one by one despite the vet's best efforts. Jonah stood on the porch, blocking the doorway instinctively. "I don't run a veterinary service, Mrs. Henley." "Please," Martha said, and there were tears in her eyes. "Doc Pritchard says it's some kind of wasting disease, says I should cull the whole flock. But these birds feed my family. If there's even a chance your girl could help." Lila appeared at Jonah's elbow before he could respond, drawn by something he couldn't name. She looked at the hen, then at Martha's face, and her expression shifted to that focused calm she wore when she was listening to things only she could hear. She reached for the bird. Martha hesitated, then handed it over. The hen was limp, barely breathing, its feathers dull and eyes filmy. Lila held it against her chest, closed her eyes, and stood perfectly still for what felt like minutes. Jonah watched Martha's face cycle through confusion, skepticism, and something close to fear. Then Lila's eyes opened. She handed the hen back to Martha and turned to the cabin. When she returned, she had chalk and wrote quickly on a piece of slate, "Not disease, poison, something they ate. Green plant with white flowers near your coop. Remove it. Give them charcoal water for 3 days." Martha stared at the words, her mouth opening and closing. How could she possibly? There is a plant like that, wild nightshade. It grew up last month near the fence. But how could she know? Lila just pointed at the words again, then at the hen, then made a drinking gesture. Charcoal water, Martha repeated slowly. For 3 days. Lila nodded. Martha looked at Jonah, at Lila, at the hen now stirring weakly in her arms. Thank you, she whispered. Lord bless you both. She turned and hurried back to her wagon, cradling the bird like a baby. Jonah waited until she was out of sight, then turned to Lila. How did you know? She wrote. Felt it. Wrong feeling inside the bird. Bitter, burning. Like the feeling comes from plants that hurt. You can feel that? The poison? I feel what the bird feels. The bird feels the poison. Jonah ran a hand through his hair, a sick feeling growing in his stomach. Lila, you can't do that for people in town. They'll talk. They already think this place is cursed. She looked at him with those dark, knowing eyes and wrote, The bird needed help. I know, but you would have me hide? I would have you safe. Safe and silent. Like I was with my father. The words hit Jonah like a slap. He opened his mouth to argue, to explain that it was different, that he was trying to protect her, not control her. But Lila had already turned away, heading back into the cabin, her shoulders stiff with an anger he'd never seen from her before. He didn't follow. He stood on the porch, watching the dust from Martha's wagon settle on the road, and felt the first cold touch of dread settle into his bones. 3 days later, Martha came back with a basket of eggs, fresh bread, and a story about how all her hens had recovered. She told her sister. Her sister told the general store owner. The general store owner told everyone who came through his door. Within a week, half of Bitter Creek knew that Jonah Reddick's strange deaf girl had saved Martha Henley's flock through some kind of miracle. The word miracle made Jonah's skin crawl. Miracles drew attention. Attention drew scrutiny. Scrutiny drew violence. But the people kept coming. A rancher with a horse that wouldn't heal from a leg wound. Lila touched the leg, felt something wrong deep in the tissue, and showed them where a splinter of wood had festered beneath the surface. They removed it, the horse recovered, and the rancher left $3 and a side of bacon, a farmer whose milk cow had stopped producing. Lila spent 10 minutes with the animal, then pointed at the farmer's young son and wrote, Boy hits her. She is afraid of him. The farmer went white, questioned his son, discovered Lila was right, and the beating stopped. The cow's milk returned. A woman with a baby that screamed through every night. Lila held the infant, felt the tight pain in its belly, and wrote, Mother's milk makes the baby hurt. Try goat milk instead. They did. The baby slept. The mother wept with gratitude. With each visit, Jonah felt the walls closing in. He watched Lila heal and help and solve problems that had stumped doctors and vets, and he watched the way people looked at her, with awe, yes, but also with that particular wariness people reserved for things they didn't understand. They're going to turn on you, he told her one night, writing the words in bold, angry strokes. People fear what they can't explain. Lila read it, then wrote back, People need help. I can help. Is that wrong? Not wrong. Dangerous. Everything is dangerous. Living with my father was dangerous. Being sold was dangerous. I choose this danger because it means I am useful. I am wanted. I am more than the silent girl who cannot hear. Jonah stared at the words, at the fierce pride in them, and realized he was fighting a losing battle. Lila had spent 19 years being invisible, being dismissed, being treated as less than whole. Now people needed her, valued her, saw her as something special. He couldn't ask her to give that up, not even for safety. But God, he wanted to. The turning point came on a Saturday in late October when Thomas Brennan brought his 8-year-old son to the ranch. The boy, Samuel, had been sick with fever for 2 weeks. Doc Pritchard had bled him twice, dosed him with every tonic he knew, and still the fever raged. The boy was dying, Thomas said, his voice breaking. Would Lila look at him? Please? Jonah wanted to refuse. Everything in him screamed to send them away, to protect Lila from whatever was burning through that child's small body. But Lila was already moving past him, kneeling beside the wagon where Samuel lay wrapped in blankets, his face flushed and his eyes glazed. She touched his forehead, and Jonah saw her flinch. Whatever she felt, it was bad. She closed her eyes, her fingers moving from the boy's forehead to his neck, his chest, his stomach. Her face grew paler with each touch, her breathing shallow and quick. Finally, she opened her eyes and reached for her slate with shaking hands. Inside his chest, left side, something growing, hot and swollen, pushing on his lung, not fever, abscess. Thomas stared at the words. An abscess? Where? The doctor didn't find anything. Lila pointed at Samuel's left side, just below his ribs. Here, deep inside. Needs to be drained, or he will die. How can you possibly know that? Thomas's voice was rising, panic and disbelief mixing into something sharp. You can't see inside him. You can't hear him. How? She knows, Jonah said quietly. I've seen her do this dozens of times. She's never wrong. Thomas looked at his son, at Lila, at Jonah. The boy's breathing was ragged, his lips tinged blue. Time was running out, and Thomas knew it. Doc Pritchard, he said finally. We have to tell Doc Pritchard. They loaded Samuel back in the wagon, and against his better judgment, Jonah saddled his horse and rode with them into town. Lila sat behind him, her arms around his waist, and he could feel the tremors running through her body. She'd used her gift hard today, pushed deeper than usual, and it had cost her. Doc Pritchard was skeptical at first, bordering on insulting. A deaf girl who couldn't speak was claiming to diagnose internal abscesses through touch? Ridiculous. Impossible. But Thomas was desperate, and Pritchard was honest enough to admit he was out of options. So he examined Samuel again, this time pressing where Lila had indicated, and the boy screamed. Pritchard's face went gray. There is something there, he said slowly. Swelling. Heat. If it's an abscess as deep as she says. He looked at Lila with something between wonder and fear. How did you know? Lila just pointed at Samuel, then at her own chest, over her heart. Pritchard worked through the afternoon, lancing the abscess under chloroform, draining the infection. Samuel survived. Within 3 days, his fever broke. Within a week, he was sitting up and asking for food. Thomas Brennan brought his family to the ranch to thank Lila personally. He brought the minister, who wanted to shake her hand and call her an instrument of God's grace. He brought his neighbors, who wanted to see the girl who had saved young Samuel's life. Jonah stood on his porch and watched them come, a parade of grateful people, and felt his world tilting toward disaster. That night, after everyone had left, after Lila had finally retreated to the cabin exhausted and pale, Jonah sat outside under the stars and tried to think. The attention was building too fast, spreading too wide. Soon it wouldn't just be people bringing sick animals and children. Soon there would be questions about how she did what she did, whether it was natural or supernatural, whether she was blessed or cursed. And when those questions came, Jonah knew from bitter experience the answers people settled on were rarely kind. He was still sitting there when Lila emerged from the cabin, wrapped in a blanket and sat beside him. She didn't write anything, just rested her head against his shoulder in a gesture that had become familiar over the weeks. Jonah put his arm around her, feeling her warmth, her breathing, the simple reality of her presence. I'm afraid, he said, knowing she couldn't hear but needing to say it anyway. I'm afraid of what they'll do when they stop being grateful and start being scared. Lila lifted her head, looked at him in the moonlight, and there was something infinitely sad in her eyes. She reached for the slate she always carried now and wrote by feel in the darkness. I know. I feel your fear. It is loud. But I cannot be small anymore. I cannot hide, even if it costs me everything. I would rather be seen as I am than invisible forever. Jonah read the words by starlight and his throat tightened. Even if being seen gets you killed? She erased the slate, wrote again. Yes, because you saw me. You know what I am, and you did not run. That is worth any danger. Lila, she put her hand over his heart, that gesture that had become her way of asking him to be still, to listen without words. He felt his heartbeat against her palm, felt the warmth of her touch through his shirt, and something in his chest cracked wide open. He was in love with her. The realization hit him like a rifle shot, sudden and devastating. Somewhere between that first day in Bitter Creek and this moment under the stars, he'd fallen in love with this strange, silent girl who heard the world's pain and carried it without complaint. He loved her fierce pride, her gentle hands, the way she made his empty cabin feel like a home. He loved her courage and her scars, and the way she looked at him like he was worth something despite all the blood on his soul. And the knowledge terrified him, because loving someone meant losing them, and Jonah had lost enough for one lifetime. Lila must have felt something change in him, because her hand pressed harder against his chest and her eyes searched his face. She wrote, "What is wrong?" Jonah couldn't answer. He just pulled her closer, held her against him while the stars wheeled overhead and the night sounds of the ranch rose around them. He felt her relax into his embrace, felt her trust in every line of her body, and he made a silent promise to himself and to her. Whatever came, whatever happened, he would not let her face it alone. They sat that way until the cold drove them inside. And when they finally parted for the night, her to the bed, him to the loft, Jonah lay awake for hours, staring at the rough beams above his head and trying to prepare himself for a storm he could feel building on the horizon. The storm broke 2 weeks later. It started with whispers. Jonah heard them when he went to town for supplies. People falling silent when he walked past, then talking louder once they thought he was out of earshot. The girl who could see inside bodies. The girl who knew things she shouldn't know. The girl who some said talked to the devil to get her information. Just talk, he told himself. Let them gossip. It'll pass. But it didn't pass. It grew. A woman claimed Lila had cursed her milk after she'd refused to pay for advice about her garden. The milk had soured on its own. Everyone knew that could happen, but the woman insisted it was Lila's doing. A man said Lila had looked at him wrong, and his best dog had died that night. The dog was 14 years old and half blind, but the man swore Lila had killed it with her evil eye. Someone remembered that Jonah's father had gone mad before his death, that this land was already cursed, that bringing a witch girl here had only made it worse. Witch. That was the word that appeared more and more, whispered in doorways and shouted in saloons. Witch girl. Devil's daughter. Unnatural thing that should be driven out or drowned. Jonah stopped going to town. He ordered supplies through messenger, paid extra to have them delivered. He kept Lila close to the ranch, turned away visitors with curt words and a rifle across his knees. But he couldn't stop the poison spreading, couldn't control the fear that was building in Bitter Creek, like water behind a dam. On a cold afternoon in November, the dam broke. Jonah was mending fence on the north pasture when he saw them coming, 8 men on horseback, riding in a tight group across his land. He recognized most of them. Thomas Brennan, whose son Lila had saved. Marcus Webb, the livery owner. Dutch Henry, a rancher from the next valley over. Others he knew by sight, if not by name. They weren't carrying torches yet, but Jonah could see them rolled and tied to their saddles. He set down his tools and walked to meet them, every muscle in his body tense, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. They stopped 50 yards from the cabin, forming a rough semicircle, and Thomas Brennan urged his horse forward as spokesman. "Reddick," he said, his voice tight with something that might have been shame or might have been fear. "We need to talk about the girl." "Nothing to talk about," Jonah said flatly. "Get off my land." "Listen to me. I said get off my land." "Your girl's a witch, Reddick." This from Dutch Henry, his face red with conviction. "She knows things no natural person could know. She lays hands on people and animals, and they either get better or worse depending on whether she likes them. That's not healing. That's sorcery." "That's bullshit," Jonah said, his voice hard as stone. "She has a gift, and she's used it to help every one of you at one time or another." "She cursed Martha Henley's chickens to make herself look like a savior when she cured them," another man called out. "It's a con, or worse." "Martha's chickens ate poison. Lila identified it. That's not a curse, that's knowledge." "Knowledge she shouldn't have," Dutch Henry was shouting now. "She touched my nephew, told me things about his nightmares, about his fears, things the boy never told a soul. How did she know that if she can't hear him? How, unless she's reading his mind, stealing his thoughts?" "She feels emotion," Jonah said, fighting to keep his voice level. "She's sensitive to pain and fear. That's not mind reading, that's empathy." "Call it what you want," Thomas Brennan said quietly. "The fact is, people are scared, Reddick. They don't understand her, and what they don't understand, they fear." "Then they're fools." "Maybe so. But we're the fools with the torches." Thomas's face was anguished. "She saved my boy's life. I know that. I'll never forget it. But I've got 5 other children at home, and their mother won't sleep at night anymore because she's convinced your girl can curse us if we cross her. Half the town feels the same way. So what are you proposing? Jonah's hand tightened on his gun. You want me to drive her out? Kill her? Burn her like a witch in the old times? We want you to send her away, Thomas said. Take her to another town, another territory, somewhere far from here. Give her money if you want, set her up somewhere safe. But get her away from Bitter Creek before this gets worse. Before you make it worse, you mean? Before someone gets hurt. Thomas met his eyes. You know how this ends, Reddick. You've seen it before. Fear turns to anger, anger turns to violence. We're trying to stop that. We're giving you a chance to do right by the girl and by the town. Jonah laughed, a sound with no humor in it. You call this doing right? Coming to my land with weapons and threats? We're not threatening you. The hell you're not. Jonah drew his revolver, and 8 hands moved to 8 guns, but he didn't aim at anyone. He just held it loose at his side, a reminder of what lines they were crossing. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to turn your horses around and ride off my property. And if I ever see any of you on my land again without invitation, I will shoot you for trespassing. That clear enough? Reddick, I'm not finished. Jonah's voice was steel. That girl you're so afraid of? She saved Thomas's son when your precious doctor had given up. She identified sickness in animals when your vets were stumped. She's helped a dozen families in the last month, asked nothing in return except to be left in peace. And this is how you repay her? By calling her a witch and demanding I throw her out? We're trying to protect our families, Dutch Henry protested. By persecuting a girl who's done nothing but help? By punishing someone for being different? Jonah shook his head. You're cowards. All of you. You come here talking about fear and safety, but what you really mean is you can't stand the idea that a deaf girl knows more than you do, feels more than you do, sees truths you're too blind to recognize. The men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Some looked ashamed, others looked angry. None of them looked away. She stays, Jonah said flatly. This is her home now. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me personally. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind kicked up dust between them, and somewhere in the distance a crow called out, harsh and mocking. Finally, Thomas Brennan nodded slowly. All right, Reddick, we've said our piece. But mark my words, this isn't over. People are scared, and scared people do terrible things. You might want to think about whether protecting her here is really protecting her at all. He turned his horse and the others followed, riding back the way they'd come. The torches stayed unlit, but Jonah could see them bouncing against saddles, ready, waiting. He stood watching until they were out of sight, then holstered his gun and turned toward the cabin. Lila stood in the doorway, her face pale, her hands clutched against her chest. She'd seen everything, felt everything, understood what the men's presence meant even without hearing their words. Jonah walked to her, and when he reached the porch, she threw herself into his arms. He caught her, held her tight, felt her shaking against him. She was crying, he realized, silent tears running down her face, soaking into his shirt. It's all right, he murmured, knowing she couldn't hear but hoping she could feel the comfort in his voice, in the way he held her. I won't let them hurt you. I swear it. But even as he said it, he knew Thomas was right. This wasn't over. The fear would grow, the stories would spread, and eventually someone would come back with more than threats and good intentions. Eventually, someone would come with fire. They went inside and Lila wrote frantically on her slate, her hand shaking so hard the words were barely legible. I should leave. I'm putting you in danger. If I go, they will leave you alone. No, Jonah said out loud, then grabbed the slate and wrote, You are not going anywhere. This is your home. Our home. They will come back. With fire. With violence. Because of me. Then let them come. I have faced worse. Jonah, please, I cannot let you die for me. He took the slate from her hands, set it aside, and cupped her face so she had to look at him. Then he did something he'd never done before. He spoke slowly, carefully, forming words with his mouth so she could read his lips, something he'd seen her do with others when she was desperate to understand. I will not let you go. Lila's eyes filled with fresh tears. She searched his face, and whatever she saw there made her breath catch. She reached up, touched his scarred cheek with her fingertips, traced the line of the old wound with heartbreaking tenderness. Then she kissed him. It was soft and tentative and tasted like tears, and it set Jonah's world on fire. He pulled her closer, deepened the kiss, poured everything he couldn't say into the desperate press of lips and breath in need. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lila was smiling through her tears. She picked up her slate and wrote, "I feel your heart. It is loud. It is saying my name." Jonah took the chalk from her hand and wrote, "It has been saying your name for weeks." They stood there in the fading afternoon light, holding each other while the shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped, and somewhere in the distance, in a town called Bitter Creek, fear continued its slow transformation into hate. But in that moment, in that cabin on that cursed piece of land, two broken people had found something worth fighting for, and whatever storms were coming, they would face them together. The kiss changed everything and nothing at all. In the days that followed, Jonah and Lila moved around each other with a new awareness, their touches lingering longer, their glances carrying weight. But the threat hanging over them didn't diminish. If anything, it grew heavier. Jonah reinforced the cabin door, checked his ammunition, kept his rifle loaded and within reach. He taught Lila to shoot, standing behind her with his arms around hers, guiding her hands on the heavy revolver. She couldn't hear the shots, but she felt the recoil, learned to anticipate it, and by the end of the week she could hit a tin can at 20 paces. He hoped to God she'd never need to. They communicated less through writing now and more through touch. A hand on the shoulder meant danger. 2 taps on the wrist meant stay close. 3 meant hide. They developed a language born of necessity and intimacy. And Jonah found himself understanding her better than he'd understood anyone in his life, even people who could speak. 2 weeks passed in tense quiet. No one came to the ranch, no more visitors arrived with sick animals or fevered children. The silence felt wrong, artificial, like the stillness before a twister touches down. Then, on a gray morning in late November, a boy appeared at the gate. Jonah saw him from the barn where he was feeding the horses. The kid couldn't have been more than 10, thin as a rail, riding a sway-backed mule. He stopped at the property line like there was an invisible wall he couldn't cross, and just sat there, staring toward the cabin. Jonah approached slowly, his hand on his gun. "What do you want?" The boy flinched at his tone. "Please, mister, I'm looking for the healing woman, the one who can feel sickness." "She's not seeing anyone right now." "But my sister—" The boy's voice cracked. "She's real sick, mister. Been sick for 3 days. Ma says it's just fever, but Sarah ain't getting better. She's getting worse. She keeps saying her head hurt something terrible, and last night she didn't know who I was." Jonah felt ice form in his stomach. "Where are you from?" "Miller's Creek. About 8 miles east. Please, mister. Doc Pritchard's out of town. Won't be back for days. And I heard your woman she can't help you." The words tasted like poison, but Jonah forced them out. "I'm sorry about your sister, but we can't—" "Jonah?" Lila's voice was soft, unused, the word barely formed but unmistakable. He turned to find her standing on the porch, her slate in hand. She'd been watching, had read the conversation in their body language and the boy's desperation. She walked down to the gate, ignoring Jonah's protest, and knelt in front of the boy. She pointed at herself, then at him, then made a questioning gesture. The boy looked confused, then understood. "Your name? It's Sarah Hutchins. She's 7, and she's burning up with fever and her head hurts so bad she cries. Except now she's stopped crying, and that's worse. Ma says that means she's giving up." Lila's face went pale. She stood, turned to Jonah, and the look in her eyes was absolute. "No," Jonah said. "Lila, think about this. If you go into town, if people see you—" She wrote quickly, "A child is dying. There are always children dying. You can't save them all. I can save this one." "At what cost? They've already threatened us once. If you leave this ranch, if you show yourself in public again—" Lila grabbed his hand, pressed it against her chest so he could feel her heartbeat, rapid and determined. Then she wrote with her other hand, the slate balanced precariously. "Would you let a child die to keep me safe? Is that who you are?" Jonah stared at the words, at this woman who saw straight through to his core, who knew exactly how to cut him where it hurt. She was right. He couldn't let a child die out of fear, no matter how justified that fear was. And she knew he couldn't, had known before she asked. "Damn it," he breathed. He turned to the boy. "How far did you say? 8 miles?" "Yes, sir. Maybe a little less if we cut through the hills." "Go back. Tell your mother we're coming. We'll be there by midday." He looked at Lila. "Both of us." The boy's face lit up with hope. He kicked the mule into motion, already turning back east. "Thank you, mister. Thank you." Jonah watched him disappear over the rise, then turned to Lila. "We're taking weapons, and if anything goes wrong, if I tell you to run, you run. Understood?" She nodded, but the stubborn set of her jaw told him she'd do no such thing. He sighed, went to saddle 2 horses, and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. They rode east under heavy clouds that promised snow. Lila sat her horse better now after weeks of practice, moving with the animal's rhythm, her hands light on the reins. Jonah kept his rifle across his saddle, his eyes scanning the horizon. The land here was open, exposed, offering little cover. If someone wanted to ambush them, this would be the place. But the ride passed without incident, and by noon they'd reached Miller's Creek. It was smaller than Bitter Creek, just a handful of buildings clustered around a crossroads. The Hutchins place was at the edge of town, a small frame house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The boy was waiting outside. "This way! She's in here!" Inside, the house was dim and close, the air thick with the smell of sickness. A woman who must have been the mother stood by a narrow bed where a small girl lay motionless, her face flushed with fever, her breathing shallow and rapid. Other children huddled in corners, watching with wide, frightened eyes. "Thank God," the mother whispered when she saw them. "Please, can you help her?" Lila was already moving to the bed, her hands reaching for the girl. The moment she touched Sarah's forehead, she gasped, not with sound, but with the sharp intake of breath that came from pain. She pulled her hand back, shook it like she'd been burned, then forced herself to touch the girl again, this time more carefully. Jonah watched as Lila's hands moved over Sarah's small body with practiced precision, forehead, neck, chest, stomach. Her face was taut with concentration, and sweat beaded on her upper lip despite the cold room. Whatever she was feeling, it was taking everything she had to process it. Finally, she stepped back and reached for her slate with trembling hands. Brain fever, infection in the fluid around her brain. The pressure is building. If it is not released, she will die tonight. The mother made a strangled sound. "How can you know that? How can anyone know that?" Lila didn't answer. She was already writing more. Her skull must be opened. A small hole to let the pressure out. I can show where, but I cannot do it. You need someone with steady hands and courage. "A hole in her skull?" The mother's voice rose toward hysteria. "You want someone to drill into my baby's head?" "It's called trepanation," Jonah said quietly. "I've seen it done during the war. It works, sometimes. Sometimes. More often than doing nothing." He looked at Lila. "You're sure about this?" She nodded, fierce and certain, and pointed at a spot on Sarah's skull just above her right ear. "Here. Very carefully. Small hole. The pressure will release, and she will breathe easier." "Who would even do such a thing?" the mother asked, and Jonah heard the desperation in her voice, the willingness to try anything. "I will." The voice came from the doorway, and everyone turned. An old man stood there weathered and bent, with hands that looked like gnarled tree roots. "I'm William Hutchins. This is my granddaughter, and I was a field surgeon with the Army of Tennessee until I got too old to hold a knife steady. But I can hold one steady enough for this, if you're certain about the location." Lila wrote, "I am certain. I feel the pressure like thunder in my own head. It will kill her if it is not released." William studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then we'd best get to it. Boy, fetch my medical kit from the house. Martha, boil water and find clean cloth. You," he pointed at Jonah, "hold her still when I start. The pain will wake her even through the fever." They worked quickly, efficiently, with the desperate focus of people who knew they were racing death. William laid out his instruments: a small hand drill, forceps, clean bandages. He sterilized everything in boiling water, muttered prayers under his breath, and approached the bed like a man going to war. Lila pointed at the exact spot again, placed William's finger there so he could feel the location. He nodded, marked it with ink, then looked at the mother. Martha, you might want to step outside. I'm staying. Then hold her hand and pray. The procedure took less than 10 minutes, but felt like hours. Sarah woke screaming when the drill bit first touched her skull, and it took both Jonah and the older boy to hold her still. Lila stood at the foot of the bed, her hands pressed against her own head, tears streaming down her face as she felt every moment of the child's pain. But William's hands were steady despite his age. He drilled carefully, precisely, exactly where Lila had indicated. When he broke through the skull, pressure released with a sound like a sigh, and fluid began to drain slowly through the small hole. Sarah's screaming stopped. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to slow and deepen. The terrible flush faded from her cheeks. William sat back, his hands shaking now that it was over. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. "It worked. It actually worked." "Will she be all right?" Martha asked, still gripping her daughter's hand. The fever should break within hours now that the pressure's released. Keep the wound clean, change the dressing twice a day, watch for infection. But yes, if the girl who told us where to drill was right about the location, and she clearly was, then Sarah should recover. He turned to Lila, who was leaning against the wall, pale and exhausted, looking like she'd just run 10 miles. "How did you know?" he asked simply. "How could you possibly know where the infection was?" Lila pulled out her slate with shaking hands and wrote, "I felt it, the pressure, the pain, like it was my own head." "That's not possible," William said, but his tone was more wondering than dismissive. "What you're describing, it's like you experienced her symptoms yourself." "I did." "Are you in pain now?" Lila nodded. William reached into his kit, pulled out a small brown bottle. "Laudanum. Take a few drops. It'll ease your head and help you rest." He paused, studying her with the careful eyes of a man who'd seen every kind of human suffering. "You have a remarkable gift, young woman. Terrifying, but remarkable." Lila took the medicine, her hands still trembling. Jonah moved to her side, put his arm around her waist to steady her. She leaned into him, and he could feel the exhaustion radiating from her body like heat from a forge. "We should go," Jonah said. "She needs to rest." "Wait." Martha had left her daughter's bedside and now stood before them, tears on her face. "I don't know how to thank you. You saved her life. Both of you." "No thanks needed," Jonah said. "But there must be something." "There is," Jonah said quietly. "Tell people what happened here today. Tell them exactly how Lila knew where the infection was, how her gift saved your daughter's life. Tell them she's not a witch or a curse. She's someone who feels what others feel, who carries their pain to help them heal. Tell them the truth." Martha nodded slowly. "I will. I swear it." They left the Hutchins house in the early afternoon, Lila swaying in her saddle, barely able to keep her seat. Jonah stayed close beside her, ready to catch her if she fell. They'd made it about a mile from town when they saw the riders. 7 men, coming fast from the west. Not the same group that had visited the ranch, but cut from the same cloth. Hard men with harder intentions. They spread out to block the road, and Jonah's hand moved to his rifle. "That's far enough, Reddick," the lead rider called. He was a big man with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, and Jonah recognized him from Bitter Creek's saloon. "We heard you were in Miller's Creek, figured you'd be coming back this way." "Then you figured right. Now move aside." "Can't do that." "See, we've got questions for the girl." "She can't answer them. She's deaf." "But she can write, can't she? And we want to know how she does what she does, how she knows things she shouldn't know." Jonah felt Lila tense beside him. He shifted slightly, putting himself between her and the riders. "She has a gift. That's all you need to know." "A gift from who? God or the devil?" "Does it matter? She just saved a child's life back in that town. Whatever the source, she uses it for good." "Or so you claim." The scarred man leaned forward in his saddle. "But we've been hearing different stories. Stories about how she cursed a man's dog, soured a woman's milk, brought bad luck to anyone who crossed her." "That sounds like witchcraft to us." "Those stories are lies told by frightened fools." "Then let her prove it. Let her come with us, show us how she does what she does. If it's natural, like you say, she's got nothing to hide." She's not going anywhere with you. That's not your choice to make. The scarred man's hand moved to his gun. We can do this easy or hard, Reddick, but either way, the girl comes with us. Jonah's world narrowed to cold clarity. 7 men, all armed. Lila barely able to sit her horse, open ground with no cover. The odds were impossible, but he'd faced impossible odds before. During the war, he'd held a position against 12 Confederate soldiers with nothing but a broken rifle and a bayonet. He'd survived by being willing to die, by making them pay such a high price for killing him that they'd decided it wasn't worth it. He could do the same now. Listen to me very carefully, Jonah said, his voice dropping to something cold and flat. That girl behind me is under my protection. Anyone who tries to take her will have to go through me. And I promise you, I will take at least 3 of you with me before I fall. So you'd better decide right now which 3 of you are willing to die today, because those are the stakes. The men shifted uncomfortably. They'd come expecting easy intimidation, a lone man they could push around. They hadn't expected someone who looked at death like an old friend. You're bluffing, the scarred man said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Try me. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind picked up, cold and sharp, promising snow. Jonah's hand stayed on his rifle, steady as stone. Behind him, he felt Lila's hand touch his back, just for a moment, a gesture of trust and goodbye. Then a new voice cut through the tension. That's enough. Everyone turned. William Hutchins was riding toward them on a gray mare, and behind him came Martha, her son, and half a dozen other people from Miller's Creek. They formed up behind Jonah and Lila, a ragged line of witnesses. These 2 just saved my granddaughter's life, William said, his old voice carrying authority. The girl used her gift to find an infection that would have killed Sarah by nightfall. She felt the child's pain like it was her own, showed me exactly where to drill, and never asked for a penny in return. That's not witchcraft. That's mercy. How can you be sure? The scarred man demanded. Because I'm a doctor, and I've been one for 40 years. What this girl can do, it's not supernatural. It's a heightened sensitivity, like some people can taste things others can't or see colors others miss. She feels sickness and pain with the same intensity most people feel heat from a fire. That's all. It's rare and it's powerful, but it's not evil. But the things people say are lies told by fearful ignorants who'd rather burn what they don't understand than learn from it. William's voice was steel now. This girl is a healer. She saved animals, crops, and now a child's life. If you men harm her, you're not protecting anyone. You're just murderers dressed up in righteous words. The scarred man looked at his companions, then back at William, at the people of Miller's Creek, at Jonah's unwavering stare. Slowly the fight went out of him. He wasn't brave enough to kill in front of witnesses who'd speak against him. This isn't over, he said finally, but it was a retreat and everyone knew it. He turned his horse and rode away, his men following with obvious relief. Jonah waited until they were out of sight before letting out the breath he'd been holding. His hands were shaking now, the aftermath of adrenaline, but he kept them steady through force of will. Thank you, he said to William. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. That girl suffered to save my granddaughter. I owe her a debt I can never repay, but speaking truth in her defense is a start. William looked at Lila with something like awe. Take care of her, Reddick. People with gifts like hers, they burn bright, but they burn fast. The world isn't kind to those who feel too much. I know, Jonah said quietly. But I'm trying. They rode back to the ranch as the first snow began to fall, fat flakes that melted on contact with the still warm ground. Lila made it halfway before she finally couldn't hold on anymore. Jonah caught her as she slumped in her saddle, pulled her onto his horse in front of him, and held her against his chest while she shook with exhaustion and residual pain. I've got you, he murmured into her hair. You're safe. I've got you. She couldn't hear him, but her hand found his and squeezed weakly, and that was answer enough. When they reached the cabin, Jonah carried her inside and laid her on the bed. She was barely conscious, her face pale as milk, her breathing shallow. The laudanum had helped, but using her gift so intensely had taken a toll that medicine couldn't fix. She needed rest, warmth, and time. Jonah built up the fire until the cabin was almost too hot, then sat beside the bed and held Lila's hand while she slept. He watched her face, the delicate bones, the dark lashes against pale cheeks, and felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. She'd almost died today. Not from violence, but from the sheer cost of caring too much, of taking another person's suffering into herself without restraint. He'd watched her feel that child's pain like it was her own, had seen the way it nearly broke her, and he understood with terrible clarity that this gift of hers was also a curse. She would never be able to turn away from suffering. Her nature wouldn't allow it. And eventually, that compassion would kill her, either through exhaustion or through the violence of people who feared what they couldn't understand, unless he could find a way to protect her from both. Lila stirred, her eyes opening slowly. They focused on Jonah's face, and a small smile touched her lips. She reached up, touched his cheek with her fingertips, and the gesture was so tender it made his throat tight. She mouthed words, her voice too weak to produce sound. "Thank you." Jonah bent down, pressed his forehead to hers. "Always," he whispered, "I will always stand between you and the world. I promise." She couldn't hear the words, but she felt them in the way he held her, in the steadiness of his presence. She closed her eyes again and drifted back to sleep, her hand still in his, and Jonah sat there in the firelight, keeping watch over the woman who'd taught him that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible. Outside, the snow fell heavier, covering the land in white silence, and somewhere in Bitter Creek, men gathered in saloons and spoke of witches and fire, and the necessity of protecting their town from unnatural things. The storm William Hutchins had warned about was building, fed by fear and ignorance, growing stronger with each passing day. But in that cabin, in that moment, two people who'd survived the worst the world could throw at them held on to each other and refused to let go. And maybe, Jonah thought, as Lila's breathing deepened into true rest, maybe that was enough. Maybe love and courage and the stubborn refusal to surrender could stand against anything, even the fires of fear. He would find out soon enough. The snow that had started as gentle flakes turned into a blizzard by nightfall, and for 3 days the world outside the cabin disappeared into white chaos. Jonah was grateful for it. The storm kept visitors away, gave them time to breathe, to heal, to exist without the weight of fear pressing down on them. Lila recovered slowly. The first day she could barely lift her head. The second, she managed to sit up and take broth. By the third, she was moving around the cabin again, insisting on helping with meals despite Jonah's protests. But something had changed in her. She moved more carefully now, as if aware of her own fragility, and sometimes Jonah would catch her staring at her hands with an expression he couldn't quite read. On the fourth morning, the storm broke. Jonah woke to brilliant sunshine reflecting off fresh snow, the world scrubbed clean and blindingly white. He climbed down from the loft to find Lila already awake, standing at the window with her slate in hand. When she heard him, she turned and held it up. "We need to talk about what happens next." Jonah poured coffee, handed her a cup, then sat at the table and gestured for her to join him. She did, setting down her slate between them like a negotiating table. "I know what you're going to say," Jonah said, then remembered and wrote it instead. "I know what you want to say." Lila wrote, "I cannot keep doing this. Every time I use my gift, I put you in danger. People fear me. They will come back. Let them. You almost died defending me. 3 days ago, you faced 7 armed men alone, and they backed down. Because William Hutchins intervened. Next time, we might not be so fortunate. Next time, they might not come with questions. They might come with rope and fire." Jonah stared at the words, at the fear behind them, and felt his chest tighten. She was right, of course. The confrontation on the road had been a warning, not an ending. The men of Bitter Creek were afraid, and that fear was building pressure like water behind a dam. Eventually it would break, and when it did, the flood would destroy everything in its path. He wrote, "So what do you want to do? Leave? Maybe. Go somewhere far away where no one knows what I can do. Start over. And never use your gift again? Never help anyone?" Lila's hand paused over the slate, the chalk hovering. Finally she wrote, "I do not know if I can stop. When I feel suffering, I cannot ignore it. It is like asking someone not to hear thunder or not to feel fire. It simply is. Then running solves nothing. Wherever we go, people will discover what you can do, And then we will face the same fear, the same violence all over again. So what then? We stay here and wait for them to kill us? Jonah reached across the table, took her free hand in his. With the other hand, he wrote, "We stay and we fight. Not with guns, but with truth. We show them that your gift is not a curse. We prove that you are not a threat. We make them see you as I see you. And how do you see me?" He paused, the chalk heavy in his hand. Then he wrote slowly, carefully. "As the bravest person I have ever known. As someone who carries the world's pain without complaint. As the woman I love." Lila's eyes widened. She stared at the words, her breath catching, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were wet with tears. She took the chalk, her hand shaking slightly, and wrote, "You love me?" "Yes. Even knowing what I am, what I can feel, especially knowing that. I am broken, Jonah. I hear nothing, but I feel too much. I am more burden than blessing." Jonah stood, moved around the table, and pulled her to her feet. He cupped her face in his hands, made her look at him, and spoke aloud even though she couldn't hear, because he needed to say the words as much as she needed to read them on his lips. "You are not broken. You are extraordinary, and I would rather face 1,000 angry mobs with you than live one day of peace without you." Lila's face crumpled. She threw her arms around his neck and held him like he was the only solid thing in a world of chaos. Jonah held her back, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the rapid beat of her heart against his chest. When she finally pulled back, she picked up the slate again and wrote with fierce determination, "Then we stay. We fight. Together. Together." She kissed him then, hard and desperate, and Jonah kissed her back with everything he had, pouring years of loneliness and grief and hope into the press of lips and the tangle of hands. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Lila was smiling through her tears. "What do we do first?" Jonah thought for a moment, then wrote, "We go to town. We face them directly. We stop hiding. That is dangerous. Everything worth doing is dangerous." Lila studied him for a long moment, then nodded. She squeezed his hand once, hard, and went to get her coat. They rode into Bitter Creek that afternoon under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The snow had drifted high in places, making the horses work, but the main road had already been cleared by traffic. As they approached the town, Jonah felt tension coiling in his gut, but he kept his face impassive, his hand resting casually near his gun. The main street was busy for a Saturday. People doing business, loading wagons, gossiping on corners. Conversation stopped as Jonah and Lila rode past. Heads turned, whispers followed them like smoke. Jonah ignored it all. He rode straight to the general store, dismounted, and helped Lila down. She stood close to him, her chin up, her eyes direct. Together they walked into the store. Inside, the proprietor, Samuel Yates, was measuring out flour for a customer. He looked up when the bell rang, and his face went through a rapid series of expressions. Surprise, discomfort, calculation. "Reddick," he said carefully. "Didn't expect to see you in town." "Need supplies," Jonah said. "Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition, the usual." Sure. Yates finished with his current customer, who scurried out with nervous glances at Lila. "I can get that together for you. Might take a few minutes." "We'll wait." Yates began gathering items, his movements jerky with tension. 2 more customers came in, saw Jonah and Lila, and quickly found reasons to leave. Within minutes, the store was empty except for the 3 of them. "Folks are talking," Yates said finally, not looking at them as he measured out coffee beans. "About the girl. About what she can do." "Let them talk." "Some of them are saying she's dangerous, that she cursed old Harry Mason's dog, soured Betty Wheaton's milk, brought bad luck to anyone who crosses her." "Those are lies," Jonah said flatly. "You know it. I know it. Anyone with sense knows it." "Maybe so, but scared people don't have much sense." Yates finally looked up, meeting Jonah's eyes. "There's talk of doing something about her, official-like. Getting the law involved, or if the law won't act, taking matters into their own hands." Jonah felt Lila tense beside him. He put a hand on her arm, steadying. "She hasn't broken any laws." "She's unnatural. That's what they're saying. And unnatural things upset the order of things, make people uncomfortable. Being uncomfortable isn't a crime. It is when enough uncomfortable people get together and decide to do something about it." Yates finished packing the supplies, wrote up a bill. I'm just warning you, Reddick, as one decent man to another. There's a meeting planned for tomorrow night, town council. They're going to discuss what to do about the witch problem. She's not a witch. I know that, you know that, but try telling that to Dutch Henry and his friends. Yates pushed the supplies across the counter. $22. And Reddick? Be careful. These are tense times. People do foolish things when they're afraid. Jonah paid, loaded the supplies into his saddlebags, and they left. Outside, more people had gathered, watching from doorways and windows. Jonah could feel their eyes like weights, could sense the fear and anger rolling off them in waves. He wondered if Lila could feel it too, if their collective hostility pressed against her senses like a physical force. They were mounting their horses when a voice called out, "Reddick, hold on!" Thomas Brennan was hurrying across the street, his face flushed with cold and urgency. He stopped a few feet away, breathing hard. "I heard you were in town," he said. "I need to talk to you, both of you." "Make it quick." "The town council meeting tomorrow. You need to be there." "Why would I attend a meeting about running us out of town?" "Because if you don't defend yourselves, no one else will." Thomas glanced at Lila, and there was genuine regret in his eyes. "I know what I said before about sending her away. I was wrong. My boy's alive because of her, and that's a debt I can't forget. But there are men in this town who don't care about debts or truth. They just want something to blame for their troubles. So what do you suggest?" "Come to the meeting. Let her show them what she can do. Let people see her gift in action, see that it's not evil or supernatural. If they meet her, talk to her, maybe they'll stop being afraid. Or maybe they'll form a mob and burn us both." "Maybe," Thomas admitted. "But if you don't come, if you hide away on that ranch, they'll fill in the blanks themselves, and what they imagine will be worse than any truth." Jonah looked at Lila. She'd been watching their mouths, trying to follow the conversation. He pulled out paper and quickly wrote a summary of what Thomas had said. She read it, her face thoughtful, then took the pencil and wrote, "He is right. We must make them see the truth. Running makes us look guilty. It also keeps you safe. I do not want safety if it means living in fear. I want truth. I want dignity. I want to stand in front of them and show them I am not their enemy." Jonah read the words and felt pride and terror warring in his chest. She was so brave, braver than he'd ever been, and he loved her for it even as he feared what her courage would cost. He turned to Thomas. "We'll be there. 8 o'clock? 7. And Reddick, bring friends if you have them. This won't be a friendly crowd." Thomas walked away, and Jonah and Lila rode out of town in silence. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than usual, the weight of the coming confrontation making the miles stretch. When they finally reached home, Jonah unsaddled the horses while Lila went inside to start dinner. The mundane domesticity of it felt surreal, given what they were about to face. That night they sat by the fire after the meal was finished, and Jonah taught Lila more words in the sign language he'd been learning from a book he'd found in town months ago. Simple things. Love, home, safe, together. She learned quickly, her hands graceful, and they practiced until the fire burned low and exhaustion pulled at them both. Before they slept, Lila wrote one more message. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that you gave me something my father never did. You gave me choice. You let me decide who I want to be. That is worth more than safety." Jonah read it twice, memorizing every word, then pulled her close and held her until she fell asleep in his arms. He stayed awake long into the night, watching the shadows dance on the ceiling, preparing himself for battle. The next day crawled past like molasses. Jonah cleaned his guns, checked their ammunition, made sure everything was in order in case they needed to leave quickly. Lila went about her chores with quiet determination, feeding the animals, tidying the cabin, moving with the focused calm of someone preparing for war. As the sun began to set, they dressed in their best clothes. Jonah put on the one good shirt he owned, brushed his hair back, tried to look like something other than a scarred hermit. Lila wore the dress he'd bought her a month ago, simple blue cotton that made her eyes look darker. She braided her hair carefully, and when she was finished, she looked young and dignified and heartbreakingly vulnerable. "You don't have to do this," Jonah said aloud, knowing she couldn't hear but needing to say it. "We can still leave, right now, ride north and never look back." But Lila was already at the door, her slate tucked under her arm, her chin up, ready. She looked at him and the message in her eyes was clear. I am done running. They rode into Bitter Creek for the second time in 2 days. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like fire. The town hall was lit up, horses and wagons crowded around it, and Jonah could hear the murmur of voices even from the street. They dismounted, and Jonah checked his gun one last time. Not because he planned to use it, using it would mean everything had gone wrong, but because having it made him feel less helpless. "Ready?" he asked Lila. She took his hand, squeezed it once, and together they walked up the steps and through the door. The hall went silent as they entered. Every head turned. Jonah counted quickly, maybe 40 people, mostly men, filling the rows of benches. At the front, behind a long table, sat 5 members of the town council, including Dutch Henry and the minister, Reverend Walsh. Thomas Brennan sat in the front row, and when he saw them he nodded slightly, a gesture of solidarity. "Reddick," Dutch Henry said, standing, "we didn't expect you to actually show up. You were discussing us. Seemed only fair we be here to defend ourselves. This isn't a trial, isn't it?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Dutch Henry's face reddened, but Reverend Walsh put a calming hand on his arm and stood. "Please, let's keep this civil," Walsh said. His voice was smooth, practiced in sermons and mediation. "Mr. Reddick, Miss Gray, we've gathered tonight to discuss concerns that have been raised about Miss Gray's activities. Several members of our community have reported disturbing incidents they believe are connected to her presence." "Disturbing incidents?" Jonah's voice was hard. "You mean the lives she saved? The animals she healed? The child whose life she preserved through her gift?" "Some would call it a gift," Dutch Henry interjected. "Others call it witchcraft." The crowd erupted in shouts and arguments. People stood, pointing at Lila, their faces twisted with anger and fear. Jonah moved instinctively in front of her, his hand on his gun, but Reverend Walsh was banging his gavel, calling for order. "Please, everyone sit down. We will discuss this rationally or not at all." Slowly, reluctantly, people returned to their seats. The hall settled into hostile silence. "Now then," Walsh continued, "I think we can all agree that Miss Gray possesses some unusual ability. The question before us is the nature of that ability and whether it poses a threat to our community. Mr. Reddick, perhaps you could explain in your own words what Miss Gray can do." Jonah looked at Lila. She nodded and held up her slate. He read what she'd already written there, prepared before they'd arrived. "I feel what others feel. Pain, fear, sickness. Not with my ears, but with my heart. When I touch someone who is suffering, I experience their suffering as my own. This allows me to identify illness and injury with precision. It is not magic. It is not evil. It is simply how I experience the world." Jonah read the words aloud, his voice carrying through the hall. When he finished, the silence was heavy with skepticism. "That's a convenient explanation," Dutch Henry said. "But how do we know it's true? How do we know she's not consorting with dark forces to gain forbidden knowledge?" "Because I've seen her work." Thomas Brennan stood up, his voice loud and clear. "She saved my son's life, diagnosed an abscess no doctor could find, and it nearly killed her to do it. I saw the pain on her face, saw her crying from experiencing my boy's suffering. That's not witchcraft. That's sacrifice." "And what about the dog that died?" someone shouted from the back. "What about Betty Wheaton's milk?" "The dog was 14 years old," another voice called. It was Doc Pritchard standing near the side door. "I examined it myself last year. It had a weak heart. It was going to die soon, regardless of who looked at it. And Betty's milk soured because she wasn't cleaning her containers properly. I told her that myself, but she'd rather blame the deaf girl than admit her own carelessness." More arguments broke out. People were standing now, shouting over each other, the meeting dissolving into chaos. Jonah felt Lila's hand grip his arm, felt her trembling against him. He turned to look at her and saw tears running down her face. Not from fear, but from something else. She was feeling all of it, he realized. The anger, the fear, the hatred rolling off this crowd like heat from a furnace. She was experiencing their emotions as her own, and it was overwhelming her. "Enough!" Reverend Walsh's voice cut through the noise like a whip. "This accomplishes nothing. If Miss Gray possesses this gift as she claims, let her prove it. Let someone here present a problem, a sickness or injury, and let her demonstrate her ability under our observation. If she succeeds, we have our answer. If she fails or refuses, we will know she's a fraud. The crowd went silent, considering. Jonah felt ice form in his stomach. This was a trap. If Lila succeeded, she'd prove she was different, otherworldly, possibly dangerous. If she failed or refused, they'd call her a liar and a witch anyway. But before he could object, Lila was tugging on his sleeve. She held up her slate with new words. I will do it. Let them see. Lila, you don't have to prove anything to these people. She shook her head firmly and wrote, Yes, I do. This is the only way. Reverend Walsh was nodding. Very well. Is there anyone here with an ailment that our medical professionals have been unable to diagnose or treat? For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, a woman in the back row stood up. She was elderly, bent with age, her face lined with pain and weariness. I'm Sarah Clemens, she said in a wavering voice. For 3 years, I've had pain in my side. Terrible pain that comes and goes with no warning. Doc Pritchard gave me tonics, tried bleeding, tried everything he could think of. But nothing helps. I wake up some mornings and can barely move for the agony of it. Doc Pritchard nodded confirmation. It's true. I've exhausted my knowledge trying to help Sarah. If Miss Gray can identify the cause, it would be a genuine demonstration of her claimed ability. Lila was already moving forward, walking down the center aisle toward Sarah Clemens. The crowd parted before her like water, people drawing back as if afraid she might touch them. Jonah followed close behind, his hand never far from his weapon. Lila reached Sarah and paused, her slate held up with a question. May I touch you? Sarah read it and nodded, though her eyes were frightened. Go ahead, child. Lila placed her hand gently on Sarah's side, where the woman had indicated the pain was worst. Immediately, Lila's face contorted. She gasped silently, her free hand clutching at her own side, and Jonah saw her knees buckle. He caught her before she fell, supporting her weight as she pressed harder against Sarah's side, her eyes closed in concentration, sweat breaking out on her forehead despite the cold room. The hall was utterly silent. Everyone watched with a mixture of fascination and horror as Lila experienced whatever Sarah felt, taking the old woman's pain into her own body. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, Lila stepped back, swaying, her face white as chalk. She took her slate with shaking hands and wrote, Stone. In the organ that makes bile. The size of a walnut. It moves, and when it moves, it blocks the flow and causes terrible pain. It must be removed by surgery, or she will die from it. Doc Pritchard moved forward, reading over Jonah's shoulder. His eyes widened. A gallstone, he breathed. Of course! The symptoms match perfectly. Intermittent pain, radiating from the right upper quadrant. I should have considered it, but I've only read about them in medical texts. I've never actually treated one. Can you remove it? Sarah asked, her voice trembling with hope. I can try. Or better yet, I know a surgeon in Dallas who specializes in abdominal surgery. If what Miss Gray says is true, if there's truly a stone that size, surgery is indeed the only option. He looked at Lila with something like awe. How did you know? You described not just the pain, but the cause with medical precision. Lila wrote, I felt the stone. Like a hard, angry thing pressing where it should not be. The feeling has shape-size location. I just translate what I feel into words. The hall erupted again, but this time the tone was different. There was still fear, still suspicion, but also wonder, possibility, hope. People were talking over each other, some arguing that it proved she was a witch, others insisting it proved she was a miracle. Then a man stood up in the middle section, his face hard and unforgiving. Jonah recognized him as one of the riders who'd confronted them on the road, the scarred man who'd demanded Lila come with them. This proves nothing except that she's unnatural, the man said loudly. No human can do what she just did. It's not possible unless she's using dark powers. She's a danger to all of us, and she needs to be removed from this town before God's judgment falls on us for harboring her. She just helped Sarah, Thomas Brennan shouted back. How is that dark power? Because she shouldn't be able to do it. It's not natural. It's not right. The argument spread like wildfire. People were on their feet again, shouting, pushing, the meeting spiraling toward violence. Jonah pulled Lila close, backing toward the door, ready to fight their way out if necessary. Then a sound cut through the chaos, a child's scream, high and terrified, coming from outside. Everyone froze. The scream came again, desperate, and then a woman's voice. "Help! Please, someone help! My boy is missing!" The hall emptied in seconds, people rushing outside toward the sound. Jonah and Lila followed, emerging into the twilight to find a woman collapsed in the street, sobbing uncontrollably. "My Tommy," she wept. "He was playing near the creek while I was in the meeting. I told him to stay close, but when I checked he was gone. I called and called, but he didn't answer. He's only 6 years old, and it's getting dark, and the creek is running high from the snowmelt." "How long ago?" Dutch Henry demanded. "Maybe 20 minutes. Maybe more. I don't know. I wasn't watching the time." "Everyone spread out," Reverend Walsh ordered. "Search the creek bank, the woods, anywhere a child might wander. Bring lanterns. Now." People scattered, grabbing lights, calling Tommy's name into the gathering darkness. Jonah started to follow, but Lila grabbed his arm. She pulled him aside, away from the crowd, and her face was intense with concentration. She knelt down, pressed both hands flat against the cold ground, and closed her eyes. Jonah understood immediately. She was listening, not with her ears, but with whatever impossible sense allowed her to feel pain and fear across distance. She was searching for a frightened child's emotional signature in the vast emptiness of the night. For a full minute she knelt there, motionless, barely breathing. The crowd kept searching, their lanterns bobbing in the darkness like fireflies, their shouts growing more desperate. Jonah stood over Lila, protecting her, giving her the time and space she needed. Then her eyes snapped open. She stood and pointed northeast, toward a rocky area upstream from town. Without waiting for confirmation or permission, she started running. Jonah followed, and behind them others saw and followed too, a growing stream of people running after the deaf girl who somehow knew where a lost child could be found. Lila ran like the hounds of hell were chasing her, her skirts hitched up, her bare feet finding purchase on rocks and frozen ground that would have sent anyone else sprawling. Jonah stayed close, his longer legs eating up the distance, and behind them came a stream of townspeople with lanterns, following the deaf girl who ran with such certainty toward something only she could sense. The creek was loud here, swollen with snowmelt, rushing over rocks in white froth that gleamed in the moonlight. The bank was treacherous, slick with ice and mud, lined with twisted trees that leaned over the water like skeletal fingers. Lila didn't slow down. She scrambled up a rocky incline, her hands bleeding from where she grabbed sharp stones for purchase, her breath coming in gasps that made white clouds in the cold air. Then she stopped so suddenly that Jonah nearly crashed into her. She stood at the edge of a drop-off where the creek had carved a deep channel, and she was staring down into the darkness with an expression of absolute focus. She pointed down toward a twisted cottonwood that had fallen across the water, creating a natural bridge that sagged dangerously in the middle. Jonah looked where she pointed and saw nothing at first. Then his eyes adjusted and he made out a small shape clinging to the underside of the fallen tree, suspended over rushing water that would sweep him away in an instant if he fell. "There!" Jonah shouted to the others. "Under the log! Someone bring rope!" People came crashing through the brush, lanterns swinging wildly, and suddenly the scene was illuminated in flickering yellow light. Tommy clung to the tree trunk with both arms and legs, his face pressed against the bark, too terrified to move or cry out. The wood beneath him was rotten and sagging, cracking under his small weight. "Tommy!" His mother screamed, trying to rush forward, but Thomas Brennan caught her. "You'll spook him and he'll fall. Let us handle this." "We need to get to him fast," Doc Pritchard said, arriving with a coil of rope. "That tree won't hold much longer. Hear it cracking?" They could all hear it now, a terrible splintering sound that came in waves each time the child shifted his weight. Tommy was crying silently, his whole body shaking, too paralyzed with fear to even call for help. "I'll go," Jonah said, reaching for the rope, but Lila grabbed his arm. She shook her head fiercely, pointed at herself, then at the tree. "No," Jonah said aloud. "You're not going out there. I'm heavier, stronger." But Lila was already moving. She stepped onto the fallen tree before anyone could stop her, her arms out for balance, her feet finding holds with uncanny precision. The tree groaned under her weight, but held. She moved forward carefully, inch by inch, while 40 people held their breath and watched. "She's going to fall," someone whispered. "She can't even hear if we warn her." "Be quiet," Thomas Brennan hissed. "Let her concentrate." Lila reached the middle of the tree where Tommy clung to the underside. She knelt carefully, bracing herself against a branch, and reached down toward the boy. Her fingers brushed his hand and he looked up, his small face streaked with tears and terror. Lila couldn't call to him, couldn't soothe him with words, but she did something else. She pressed her hand against the tree trunk near his face and closed her eyes, and somehow, impossibly, the boy calmed. His breathing slowed, his grip relaxed slightly. He looked at Lila with something like wonder, as if she was speaking to him in a language only he could hear. "She's calming him somehow," Doc Pritchard breathed, feeling his fear and sending back reassurance. "My God." Lila opened her eyes and reached down again, this time with both hands. Tommy looked at her, looked at the rushing water below, looked back at her steady gaze. Then, with the trust only a child could muster, he let go with one hand and grabbed hers. The tree cracked loudly. Everyone gasped, but Lila was already moving, hauling Tommy up with strength that shouldn't have existed in her small frame, pulling him onto the top of the tree trunk and into her arms. She stood carefully, the boy clinging to her like a monkey, and began making her way back. The tree was failing now, cracking and groaning with every step. Lila moved faster, throwing caution aside, running the last few feet as the rotten wood gave way beneath her. She leapt just as the tree collapsed into the creek with a tremendous splash, and strong hands caught her and Tommy both, pulling them onto solid ground. Tommy's mother was on them in an instant, sobbing, pulling her son from Lila's arms and crushing him against her chest. The boy was crying now too, but they were tears of relief, and he was whole and safe and alive. The crowd erupted in cheers and shouts. People pressed forward, some trying to touch Lila, others calling out thanks and blessings. Jonah pushed through to her, pulled her away from the crush of bodies, and wrapped his arms around her. She was shaking violently, her clothes soaked from spray, her feet bleeding, her hands raw. "You could have died," Jonah said into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "That tree could have collapsed with you on it." She pulled back, looked at him, and her eyes were fierce. She pulled out her slate, wrote quickly. "But it did not, and the boy is safe. That is what matters." "Lila, would you have done differently?" Jonah stared at her, at this impossible woman who'd just risked her life for a child she didn't know, and he knew the answer. No, he wouldn't have done differently. He would have done exactly what she did, because some things mattered more than safety. "No," he admitted. "I wouldn't have." "Then do not be angry with me for being like you." Despite everything, Jonah felt a laugh bubble up in his chest. She was right. She was always right. Around them, the crowd was still celebrating, passing Tommy around like a miracle, praising God and luck, and the deaf girl who'd somehow known where to find him. But gradually, the celebration quieted as people began to process what they'd witnessed. Dutch Henry stepped forward, his face troubled. "How did you know?" he asked Lila, though she couldn't hear him. Jonah translated the question on her slate. She wrote, "I felt his fear, like a bright, painful thing calling to me. Fear has a feeling. Terror has a location. I followed it." Dutch read the words, and something shifted in his hard face. "You felt a child's terror from half a mile away, in the dark, with no way to hear him crying." Lila nodded. "And you ran toward it instead of away from it." Another nod. Dutch looked at the crowd, at the faces watching him, waiting for his judgment. He was one of the leaders here, one of the loudest voices calling Lila a witch and a danger. What he said next would matter. "I was wrong," he said finally, his voice carrying across the gathering. "I called this girl unnatural. I said she was a threat. But what kind of threat runs toward a child's terror instead of away? What kind of witch saves lives instead of taking them?" He turned to Lila, and there was shame in his eyes. "I'm sorry, miss. I let fear make me stupid and cruel. You're not a curse. You're a blessing, and this town should be thanking God for sending you instead of trying to drive you away." The scarred man who'd been arguing in the meeting pushed forward. "But she's still unnatural, Dutch. You said it yourself. No human should be able to do what she does." "Maybe not," Dutch agreed. "But I've known men who could track like bloodhounds, women who could predict weather by the ache in their bones, children who could calm wild horses with a look. The world's got mysteries in it, and not all of them are evil. Maybe some folks are just born different, born with senses the rest of us don't have. That don't make them devils. It just makes them special. But nothing, Carl. Dutch's voice was firm now. She just saved Tommy's life. That's the third life she's saved that I know of. Probably more I don't. And she didn't ask for money or praise or anything except to be left alone. If that's what evil looks like, then I'm a damn fool. He looked at the crowd. Anyone else want to argue that this girl's a threat? Anyone want to explain to Martha there why her boy should have been left to drown because we were too scared of something different? Silence. Martha was still holding Tommy, still crying, and the sight of her joy was answer enough. Reverend Walsh stepped forward, his face solemn. I believe, he said carefully, that we have witnessed something profound tonight. Miss Gray possesses a gift that defies our understanding, yes, but gifts from God often do. The prophets heard voices, the apostles spoke in tongues. Holy men throughout history have experienced the divine in ways that frightened and confused those around them. He looked at Lila with respect. Perhaps we should be asking not whether her gift is natural, but whether we have the wisdom to accept it with gratitude rather than fear. Amen to that, Thomas Brennan said loudly, and others echoed him. The scarred man, Carl, looked around at the changing mood, saw that he'd lost, and turned away angrily. But he was alone now. The crowd had shifted, had seen something that broke through their fear, and there was no putting that genie back in the bottle. Doc Pritchard approached Lila, his medical bag in hand. Miss Gray, may I examine your feet and hands? You're bleeding, and I'd like to prevent infection. Lila looked at Jonah, who nodded. She sat on a rock while Pritchard cleaned and bandaged her wounds, his touch gentle and professional. While he worked, people began approaching one by one, offering thanks, apologies, blessings. Some brought blankets to warm her. Others offered food, water, anything she might need. Sarah Clemens, the old woman from the meeting, knelt beside Lila with tears streaming down her face. You're going to help me, she said, though Lila couldn't hear her. You found what was hurting me after years of suffering. How can I ever repay that? Lila wrote on her slate, no payment needed. I only want to help. But you must want something. Everyone wants something. Lila thought for a moment, then wrote, I want to be allowed to help without fear. I want to use my gift without people calling me evil. I want to belong. Sarah read the words and nodded. Then you have it, child. You belong here now. Anyone who says different will answer to me. Others crowded around to read what Lila had written, and Jonah watched as the message spread through the crowd like ripples in water. People began nodding, agreeing, calling out their support. The fear that had driven them to that meeting, that had nearly turned into violence, was transforming into something else. Acceptance. Maybe even gratitude. It wasn't universal. Jonah could see a few faces still tight with suspicion, still unwilling to let go of their fear. Carl and his friends were muttering among themselves, casting dark looks. But they were the minority now, and they knew it. As the crowd began to disperse, families heading home with their lanterns, Tommy's mother approached Lila one more time. The boy was in her arms, already half asleep, exhausted from terror and relief. Thank you, Martha whispered, and even though Lila couldn't hear the words, the emotion behind them needed no translation. She pressed something into Lila's hand, a small silver locket on a chain. This was my mother's. It's all I have of value, and I want you to have it, please. Lila tried to refuse, but Martha insisted, clasping the locket around Lila's neck with trembling hands. Then she kissed Lila's forehead, blessed her, and walked away with her son safe in her arms. Jonah helped Lila stand. She swayed with exhaustion, and he realized she'd used her gift multiple times today, feeling Sarah's gallstone, sensing Tommy's fear across distance, calming the terrified boy on the tree. Each use took something from her, and she had nothing left to give. We're going home, he said to anyone listening. She needs rest. Of course, Reverend Walsh agreed. And Mr. Reddick, perhaps you and Miss Gray would consider staying in town tomorrow. There are several people who'd like to speak with you about consulting with Miss Gray on various medical matters, properly, with compensation. We'll think about it, Jonah said, unwilling to commit to anything while Lila was barely standing. They rode home through the moonlight, Lila sitting in front of Jonah this time, leaning back against his chest, too tired to sit upright. He wrapped one arm around her waist, holding her secure, and guided the horse with the other hand. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant overhead, and the world felt different somehow, like something fundamental had shifted. When they reached the cabin, Jonah carried Lila inside and laid her on the bed. She was already half asleep, her eyes fluttering closed. He removed her wet clothes, dressed her in one of his old shirts, and tucked blankets around her. She murmured something soundless, reached for his hand and held it against her chest as she fell into deep sleep. Jonah sat beside her, watching her breathe, and felt the last of his fear begin to dissolve. They'd faced the worst tonight: the mob, the accusations, the very real possibility of violence, and they'd survived it. More than survived. They'd changed minds, turned fear into respect, proven that Lila's gift was a blessing and not a curse. It wouldn't be perfect going forward. There would still be people who feared her, still be whispers and suspicion. But the foundation had been laid. Lila had shown the town who she really was, and enough of them had seen the truth that the rest would have to fall in line or be outcast themselves. Jonah dozed in the chair, waking occasionally to check on Lila, to add wood to the fire, to reassure himself that she was still breathing. Sometime near dawn, she stirred and opened her eyes. She saw him watching over her and smiled, a soft, sleepy expression that made his heart turn over. She reached for her slate, kept always nearby now, and wrote, "We did it." "You did it," Jonah corrected, writing his response. "I just stood there looking threatening." "You stood with me. That was everything." "How do you feel? Tired? Sore? Happy?" She paused, then added, "Free." Jonah read the last word and understood. For the first time since her father had sold her, since she'd been bound and put on a platform like livestock, Lila was truly free. Free to be herself, to use her gift, to live without hiding or fear. "What happens now?" she wrote. Jonah thought about the question, about the future that stretched before them, uncertain but no longer terrifying. He wrote, "We build a life, here on this ranch, together. We help people who need help. We raise horses. We survive winters and celebrate summers. We grow old watching sunsets from the porch. That sounds perfect." "There's one more thing." Lila looked at him with questioning eyes. Jonah set down the slate, reached into his vest pocket, and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He'd been carrying it for weeks, waiting for the right moment, and this felt as right as any moment would ever be. He unwrapped it to reveal a simple gold ring, thin and unadorned, the kind a rancher with limited means could afford. He held it out to her, and even though he couldn't say the words aloud in a way she'd hear them, he mouthed them carefully so she could read his lips. "Will you marry me?" Lila's eyes went wide. Her hand flew to her mouth and tears spilled over onto her cheeks. She stared at the ring, at Jonah's face, at the ring again. Then she grabbed her slate and wrote with shaking hands, "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Jonah slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, catching the firelight, and Lila held up her hand to look at it with an expression of such pure joy that Jonah felt his own eyes sting with emotion. She launched herself at him, wrapping her arms around his neck, kissing him with desperate happiness. He caught her, held her, kissed her back, and they stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other and the promise of a future they'd fought so hard to claim. When they finally pulled apart, Lila wrote, "When?" "As soon as you want. Tomorrow if you like. Tomorrow is too soon. I want time to prepare, to make it special." She paused, thinking, then wrote, 2 weeks. That gives us time to invite people, to do it properly. You want a real wedding? With guests and ceremony? Yes, I want everyone to see. I want to stand up in front of the whole town and choose you, publicly, proudly. No more hiding. Jonah read the words and felt his throat tighten. A public wedding, a declaration, a refusal to skulk in shadows or apologize for their love. It was so like her, so perfectly, fiercely Lila. "Then we will have a real wedding," he wrote. "The biggest this town has ever seen." They spent the next 2 weeks in a flurry of preparation. Word of the engagement spread through Bitter Creek like wildfire, and to Jonah's surprise, people were genuinely happy for them. Women brought fabric for Lila's dress. Men offered to help build benches for guests. Reverend Walsh volunteered to perform the ceremony free of charge. "It's the least I can do," he said when Jonah tried to pay him. "That girl saved 3 lives that I know of, probably more. Having her married properly, welcomed into our community publicly, it's important. It sends a message that we're better than our fears." Thomas Brennan and Doc Pritchard took charge of building a proper altar behind the church, under the cottonwood trees where the light filtered down in golden shafts. Martha decorated it with late autumn flowers and ribbons. Sarah Clemens, who was already feeling better after consulting with a surgeon in Dallas about her gallstone, baked a cake 3 layers high. People who'd been afraid of Lila weeks before now sought her out, bringing sick relatives and injured animals, asking for her help with the shy respect people reserve for the truly gifted. Lila helped everyone she could, though Jonah made sure she paced herself, made sure she rested between each use of her gift. "You can't save everyone," he told her one evening after she'd spent the afternoon diagnosing a rancher's mysteriously sick cattle. She wrote, "I can try. You will burn yourself out. Then I will burn brightly." Jonah couldn't argue with that. It was who she was, someone who would give until she had nothing left, who would carry the world's pain because she couldn't do otherwise. All he could do was make sure she didn't have to carry it alone. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and unseasonably warm, as if the world itself was celebrating. Jonah dressed in his best clothes. New trousers he'd bought special, a white shirt, a vest that actually fit. He even trimmed his hair and shaved the worst of his beard, trying to look like something other than a hermit who'd stumbled out of the hills. He wasn't allowed to see Lila before the ceremony. The women of Bitter Creek had claimed her the night before, taking her to stay with Thomas Brennan's family, and they guarded her like treasure. So Jonah waited at the church with mounting nervousness, watching as people arrived in wagons and on horseback, filling the benches and standing in the back when the seats ran out. The whole town came. Even Carl and his friends showed up, though they stood at the far edge of the crowd with sour expressions. Dutch Henry arrived with his whole family, including a shy daughter who carried flowers. Doc Pritchard came with his medical bag, just in case, and Sarah Clemens came leaning on a cane but smiling brighter than the sun. When everyone was assembled, when the afternoon light slanted golden through the trees, the music started, a simple fiddle tune played by an old rancher who'd fought in the same regiment as Jonah during the war. And then Lila appeared. She wore a dress of pale blue that the women had sewn together from contributions of fabric, lace, and love. Her dark hair was braided with white ribbons, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers mixed with the last roses of the season. She was barefoot by choice, having always hated shoes, and somehow that made her look even more beautiful, wild and free and entirely herself. But it was her face that stopped Jonah's breath. She was radiant with happiness, with hope, with the absolute certainty of someone who'd found exactly where they belonged. Her eyes found his across the gathered crowd, and the smile she gave him could have lit the darkest night. Thomas Brennan walked her down the makeshift aisle, having volunteered for the role after Lila made it clear she'd die before letting her father anywhere near her wedding. The crowd stood as she passed, and Jonah heard the whispers, not of fear or suspicion now, but of admiration and blessing. When she reached the altar, Thomas placed her hand in Jonah's and stepped back. They stood facing each other while Reverend Walsh began the ceremony, speaking words about love and commitment and the sacred bonds of marriage. Jonah barely heard any of it. He was too busy looking at Lila, at the way the light caught in her hair, at the happiness in her eyes, at the simple miracle of her presence. When Walsh prompted him for his vows, Jonah spoke them clearly, watching Lila's face as she read the words on his lips. "I, Jonah Reddick, take you, Lila Gray, to be my wife. I promise to stand with you against whatever storms come. I promise to see you always, to hear the words you don't speak, to carry your burdens when they become too heavy. I promise to love you without condition, to choose you every day for the rest of my life." Lila's eyes filled with tears. When it was her turn, she couldn't speak her vows aloud, but Walsh had prepared for that. He handed her a slate, and she wrote carefully while someone read the words to the crowd. "I, Lila Gray, take you, Jonah Reddick, to be my husband. You saw me when I was invisible. You heard me when I had no voice. You gave me freedom and home and love I never thought I deserved. I promise to stand beside you, to feel your heart with mine, to choose courage over fear. I promise to love you with everything I am, in silence and in truth, until my last breath. There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd by the time the reading finished. Reverend Walsh pronounced them husband and wife, and when he told Jonah he could kiss his bride, the cheer that went up could probably be heard in the next county. Jonah pulled Lila close and kissed her thoroughly, not caring about the crowd, not caring about anything except the woman in his arms and the future they'd just promised to each other. When they finally broke apart, both grinning like fools, the celebration began in earnest. There was food, more than Jonah had ever seen gathered in one place, pies and roasts and vegetables and breads, contributed by families who wanted to show their support. There was music, 3 different fiddle players taking turns, and dancing that went on until the stars came out. People who'd never spoken to Jonah before came to shake his hand, to congratulate him, to welcome him properly into the community. And through it all, Lila moved like a queen, gracious and smiling, accepting well wishes and blessings with genuine gratitude. She danced with Jonah, with Thomas, with Doc Pritchard, with anyone brave enough to ask, and she did it with such joy that it was impossible not to be happy watching her. As the party wound down and people began heading home, Dutch Henry approached Jonah with something in his hands, a wooden sign, carved and painted with careful precision. "Made this for you two," he said gruffly. "Thought you might hang it at your gate." Jonah took it and read the words burned into the wood. "Reddick Ranch, home of Jonah and Lila. All who need help are welcome." "Dutch, this is... thank you." "Don't thank me, just keep doing what you're doing. Keep letting her help people. God knows this territory needs more healing and less hurting." He stuck out his hand. "And I'm sorry for everything I said before, for the way I treated you both." Jonah shook his hand. Apology accepted. When the last guest finally left, when the sun was setting in shades of orange and purple, Jonah and Lila climbed into their wagon for the ride home. They were both exhausted, overwhelmed, happier than either had thought possible. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, comfortable, the silence between them full of contentment rather than emptiness. When they arrived home, Jonah carried Lila over the threshold, tradition, even if she couldn't hear him explain it, and set her down gently in their cabin. Their cabin. Their home. Their life together, just beginning. That night, they lay together in the bed they would share for the rest of their lives, and Lila wrote one last message on her slate before setting it aside forever that evening. "Thank you for saving me." Jonah took the chalk and wrote beneath her words, "You saved me first." And it was true. She'd saved him from loneliness, from the prison of his past, from a life lived in shadows and silence. She'd given him purpose and hope and love, and in return he'd given her the only things that really mattered: safety, dignity, and the freedom to be exactly who she was. Years passed, measured not in dramatic events, but in the quiet accumulation of days. Lila's reputation as a healer spread far beyond Bitter Creek. People traveled from distant towns to consult with her, bringing sick children and mysterious ailments and grateful hearts. She helped everyone she could, though she learned to pace herself, to accept that she couldn't save the whole world, and that was okay. Jonah expanded the ranch, built additional buildings, trained horses that became famous across 3 territories for their calm temperaments and sure feet. People said the Reddick horses were special because they were raised by a woman who could communicate with them in ways that had nothing to do with words. And they weren't entirely wrong. Children came to the ranch to learn from Lila, not just about healing, but about listening. She taught them to pay attention to the things most people ignored, to trust their instincts, to sit quietly with animals and plants and people until they understood what was needed. Some of them developed their own gifts, small versions of her sensitivity, and Lila encouraged them all, showed them that being different was a strength and not a curse. On warm evenings, Jonah and Lila would sit on the bench he'd built under the cottonwood tree, watching the sun set over land that had once felt cursed, but now felt blessed. They would hold hands and share silence, and sometimes Lila would rest her head on his shoulder and feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, the only sound she needed. The town council eventually asked Lila to serve in an official capacity as a medical consultant, working alongside Doc Pritchard to help diagnose difficult cases. She accepted, though she refused any payment beyond basic living expenses, preferring to help freely. Pritchard called her the best diagnostic tool he'd ever had access to, and together they saved more lives than either could count. Dutch Henry became one of their closest friends, bringing his family to the ranch for dinners, helping with the hard work of running the place, standing up for them whenever the old fears tried to resurface. Thomas Brennan's son Samuel, the boy whose life Lila had saved with her diagnosis of his abscess, grew up wanting to be a doctor, inspired by the woman who'd seen what no one else could see. Not everyone accepted Lila. Carl and his friends remained hostile, spreading rumors when they could, muttering about unnatural things and the downfall of decent society. But they were the minority now, voices shouting into a wind that carried them away unheard. Most people in Bitter Creek and the surrounding territory came to see Lila as Jonah had always seen her, as a person with an extraordinary gift who used it for good, who asked nothing for herself, who made the world a little less painful by being willing to feel its pain. On their 5th anniversary, Jonah surprised Lila with a small addition to the cabin, a room with windows on 3 sides where the light poured in like water, where she could work with people who came seeking her help. He'd carved signs on the walls in several languages, including the sign language they'd been teaching each other, all saying the same thing: you are seen, you are heard, you are safe. Lila stood in that room and cried, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of being understood so completely. She turned to Jonah and signed the words they'd practiced 1,000 times. I love you. He signed back, always. They never had children of their own, but they didn't need to. The ranch became a gathering place for lost souls and wounded creatures, for children who needed guidance and adults who needed hope. Lila mothered them all with the fierce protective love of someone who'd once been lost herself, and Jonah taught them about hard work and integrity and standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult. As they grew older, gray threading through their dark hair, laugh lines deepening around their eyes, people began to tell stories about them, about the rancher who'd bought a girl at auction and found a wife, about the deaf woman who could hear hearts breaking and pain crying out across distances, about the love that had transformed a cursed piece of land into a place of healing. The stories grew in the telling, becoming legend, becoming myth, but the truth at their core remained simple and unadorned. 2 damaged people had found each other in the darkness, had chosen love over fear, had built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their pasts. On a spring morning 30 years after that first auction in Bitter Creek, when the wildflowers covered the hills in carpets of color and the new foals were running in the pasture, Lila woke feeling different. She was older now, her body bearing the marks of decades spent carrying others' pain, but her eyes were still bright, still full of the fierce compassion that had defined her life. She felt Jonah beside her, his breathing steady in sleep, and she reached out to touch his face with the tenderness of long familiarity. He woke at her touch, smiled at her the way he'd been smiling at her for 3 decades, and took her hand. She signed to him. No regrets? He signed back. Not a single one. You? Only that I cannot hear your voice. I would have liked to know what it sounds like when you say you love me. Jonah pulled her close, pressed his lips against her forehead, and then spoke aloud, knowing she couldn't hear but needing to say it anyway, the words vibrating through his chest where her head rested. I love you, Lila Reddick. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. You taught me that silence can speak volumes, that feeling deeply is strength, not weakness, that love requires courage. You saved my life by walking into it, and every day since has been a gift I never deserved but will always treasure. Lila couldn't hear the words, but she felt them in the rumble of his chest, in the way his arms tightened around her, in the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. And she understood, the way she always understood, with senses that went deeper than sound or sight. They rose together and went about their day, tending animals, greeting visitors, living the life they'd built together through stubbornness and love and the refusal to let fear win. And when evening came, when the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they sat on their bench under the cottonwood tree and watched the world turn beautiful around them. We did it, Jonah said, signing as he spoke. We built a good life. We built a life worth living, Lila signed back. Together. That is all anyone can ask. As darkness fell and stars appeared overhead, They remained sitting shoulder to shoulder, two souls who had found each other against all odds, who had chosen love when hate would have been easier, who had proven that the truest form of hearing had nothing to do with ears and everything to do with the heart. The ranch would continue long after they were gone, tended by the children they'd helped raise, by the community they'd helped heal. The story of the deaf girl who heard everything and the scarred rancher who learned to listen would be passed down through generations, growing richer with each telling. But the heart of the story would always remain the same. The two unlikely people had met in a dusty town square, had recognized something essential in each other, and had spent their lives proving that love was stronger than fear, that kindness was more powerful than cruelty, and that the silence between two people who truly understood each other could be the loudest declaration of all. In the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.